Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. From 4th grade until the end of 5th grade, I lived in this somewhat rundown apartment complex. While it wasn't the kind of place where you'd find drug dealers at your door, it certainly wasn't the nicest establishment either. One night, I was lying in bed listening to staticky country music from my old radio, trying to fall asleep, when I heard loud banging from somewhere in the building. At first, I couldn't pinpoint exactly where the noise was coming from, but then I realized it was coming from the apartment above us. It sounded like someone was repeatedly hitting the floor. Out of tiredness and annoyance, I turned down my radio and listened more carefully. That's when I heard it, a little girl, probably around 6 years old, crying and continuing to bang on the floor. Frustrated by the noise, I stood up on my bed and banged on the ceiling. She stopped. The next night, the same thing happened. I heard the banging, turned down my radio, and banged on the ceiling in response. This peculiar form of communication continued for 3 days. This little girl and I exchanging signals through the floor and ceiling. On the 4th day, she kept banging and crying, but this time she was also screaming. It was really late at night, and I don't think anyone else heard it, but the sound was horrifying, like someone was slowly torturing a small animal. I banged on the ceiling to check if she was okay, and everything went quiet for a moment. I banged again, and after a few seconds, she started crying once more. Then I heard this absolutely thunderous crash. It sounded like someone had dropped a massive piece of furniture from standing height. After that, everything went completely silent. I never saw or heard from the little girl or her mother again. I didn't even see them move out, but I knew they were gone. This wasn't the only strange behavior from that family. The mother would often wander aimlessly around the complex, and the little girl would frequently be found alone in the elevator. We'd occasionally catch glimpses of them doing other odd things, but nothing concrete enough to raise serious concerns. They were just different. Looking back now, I wonder if there was something more sinister going on in that apartment. Was the mother abusive? Was the little girl trying to signal for help? I never found out what happened to them, but I still think about that little girl sometimes, hoping she's okay wherever she is. In January 2011, my then boyfriend and I flew to New York City for his 21st birthday. We were both incredibly excited. We'd never been overseas before. We're Australian, and we were really looking forward to experiencing the city. We arrived at Kennedy International Airport around 10:30 at night, exhausted from the long flight. As we waited for our luggage, which seemed to take forever to appear on the carousel, we listened to the repeated warnings over the loudspeaker stating that passengers should only use official yellow cabs and avoid getting into unmarked vehicles. Finally getting our bags, we headed for the exits where several taxis were waiting. A man in what appeared to be a driver's uniform approached us and asked if we needed a ride. We said yes, and he grabbed my suitcase, starting to walk away. My stomach dropped when he walked straight past all the official taxis and continued into a poorly lit parking area across the road. We followed him cautiously because he had my luggage, but we started expressing our hesitation and saying we'd rather go back. He stopped at a black luxury sedan and turned to me, saying, "Don't worry, baby, I'm legitimate." At that moment, I snatched my bag back, and we bolted out of there as fast as we could, running straight to an official yellow taxi. The taxi driver, watching us scramble into his car, shook his head and said, "Yeah, you were either about to get kidnapped or murdered. You gotta be careful out here." So to the man who grabbed my suitcase and tried to do God knows what to a naive tourist experiencing New York City for the first time, let's never meet again. My mom was kidnapped when she was in her mid-20s. The fact that this wasn't her first kidnapping makes the story even more incredible. I have a copy of the newspaper article from this incident, and I recently called my mom to verify some details before sharing this story. This is her account as she told it to me. Until the early 2000s, our small town was the epitome of rural safety. Crime was so rare that when it did happen, it was usually something minor like Timothy Fisher taking Mrs. Anderson's convertible for a joyride, or Robert Wilson spray painting rival school slogans on the gymnasium wall. We were so secure that nobody locked their doors or cars. My mom even kept her purse in her vehicle 24/7, never bothering to lock it. No one ever touched it. One night, while my father was working his night shift at the manufacturing plant, my mother was at home doing laundry and ironing in front of the television. Feeling lonely, she decided to let her cats, Midnight and Whiskers, inside. My father was strict about keeping animals outdoors, believing they were unsanitary. So she would secretly let them in for company when he worked nights, making sure to put them out before he returned home. While ironing, she noticed a tear in my dad's work pants. Her sewing machine was broken, so she decided to go to my grandmother's house to use hers. The cats were comfortable, so she left them inside, planning to return quickly. On her way, she stopped at the post office to pick up some tax forms she needed for her accountant. Back then, the post office lobby remained open 24/7, allowing access to forms and stamp machines at any hour. At the time, my mom drove a sporty Pontiac Firebird, something that would later prove significant to the story. Since she was just running in and out, she did the unthinkable by today's standards. She left the car running with the keys in the ignition. After all, this was small-town America, where crime simply didn't happen. When she got back into the car, her mind was preoccupied with the tear in my dad's pants. She didn't notice the two men in her backseat until she looked in the rearview mirror to pull out. They told her to drive and not make any trouble, saying they had a loaded gun. These men, as it turned out, were fleeing after robbing a gun store several towns away. They'd chosen my mom's car because it was a fast, late-model sports car, and she'd made their job easier by leaving it running. My mom never understood why they didn't just steal her car and leave her behind. After taking her, they spent hours debating what to do with her, discussing their limited options right in front of her. Eventually, their conversation turned to the disposal of her body. Hours passed as they drove further and further from home. But my mom is a survivor. She never gave up hope, constantly looking for an opportunity to escape. The journey naturally required occasional stops for bathroom breaks and fuel. The men would let my mom use the restroom, but they always stood guard outside the door. Finally, they stopped at another gas station. This time, when my mom went to the bathroom, she noticed a small window. It was too small to climb through, but through it, she could see a vacant lot. She decided this might be her only chance. She would try to run across that field when she left the bathroom, as the men were blocking her path to the gas station. When she exited the restroom, something miraculous happened. The men had stepped around the corner, something they'd never done before. She could still hear their voices, but they weren't in sight. As she gathered her courage to run, a police car pulled into the station. My mom started signaling to the officer from where she stood, trying not to move into view of her captors. The officer initially rolled his eyes, later telling her he thought she was just some drunk person. But my mom persisted, and finally, the officer decided to investigate. After she quickly explained her situation, the police acted swiftly, and her kidnappers were arrested. They took my mom to the nearest police station to give her statement and called my dad to pick her up. She has no clear memory of how long the ordeal lasted. She knows it was less than 24 hours, and that my dad was off work by the time she called him. When my dad arrived to take her home, he was strangely quiet. My mom, assuming he was just worried and upset, asked if he was okay. Here's the kicker, my dad turned to her, looked into the eyes of his wife who had just narrowly escaped death, and said, "I thought we agreed that the cats were to stay outside." My friends and I were exploring the old St. Matthew's Asylum on Halloween night. It had been abandoned for years, and while security patrolled during the day, an elderly man with a large German shepherd who claimed to own or maintain the property. He usually went home at night. The building had actually been featured on a popular paranormal investigation show several years back, which naturally made it a magnet for local thrill seekers during twilight hours. I'd visited a few times before. The place was usually relatively busy with adventure-seeking teenagers and the occasional group of people smoking marijuana, looking for a quiet spot away from police attention. Sometimes you'd encounter groups of local troublemakers, but they were generally harmless if you kept your distance. That Halloween, a group of friends, my girlfriend Rachel, and I decided to go ghost hunting. We arrived much later than intended. It was actually November 1st, around 2 in the morning, but we figured that might help us avoid the crowds. There were 5 of us: myself, Rachel, my friend Nathan and his girlfriend Olivia, and Nathan's friend Marcus. To reach the entrance, you needed to follow a small section of tree line. As we were heading through this area, we spotted a group of men walking toward us. Marcus started panicking, thinking it was the police. Technically, we were trespassing. But Nathan and I tried reassuring him everything was fine. One of the men shouted something like, "Security. Stay where you are." He had a distinct accent that definitely wasn't local to our area. Nathan, who frequented the place as he lived nearby, called back, "They don't have security here, nice try." The men laughed and said, "You got us," and we all went our separate ways. No big deal, we thought. But then Rachel told me something disturbing. After we passed those 3 men, they had turned off their flashlights. Given how incredibly dark the place was, this seemed odd. She also felt like we were being followed. I informed the others, and Marcus started freaking out again. Nathan and Olivia insisted everything was fine. Another detail worth noting: these men weren't the usual visitors we'd see at the asylum. They appeared to be in their mid-40s, all quite large and broad-shouldered. Not your typical sight at an abandoned asylum at 2 in the morning. As we continued exploring, we started hearing things landing behind us. We looked back but couldn't see anything. More objects started landing around us. Stones were being thrown in our direction. We couldn't determine where they were coming from, but they seemed to be coming from nearby windows. We started shouting up at the windows, throwing in a few choice words at whoever was throwing them. They remained silent, just occasionally throwing more stones. After both Rachel and Nathan got hit, we collectively decided it was time to leave. Marcus and Rachel wanted to run, but Nathan convinced us that they were likely just trying to scare us, so we shouldn't panic or run. We managed to walk away casually, still shouting back as more stones were thrown our way. We made it around the rest of the asylum without much trouble and headed back toward the car via a different route, across a field near the edge of the property. That's when I noticed movement. I told the others I thought I saw people coming out of a small door at the bottom of the building. Nathan shined his flashlight over, and sure enough, it was the same 3 men from earlier, without their flashlights, emerging from the route we had just taken almost as if they had been following us. To clarify, when we first encountered them, they had been heading toward one of the exits, appearing to leave. We pieced it together and realized they were likely the ones throwing stones at us, as the projectiles had come from windows in the building we'd just been in. We walked back along the field while the men followed at a distance, not as if they were trying to catch us, but maintaining a steady pace. By the time we reached our car, they had disappeared from sight. I don't think they intended to seriously harm us, beyond the occasional stone. They were probably just trying to frighten us. Either way, Rachel and I both felt very uneasy. Marcus and Nathan were terrified and stressed the whole way back, and Olivia seemed oddly calm about the whole thing, if not slightly annoyed. It was definitely something that creeped us all out and became a topic of conversation for the rest of the night. For context, I grew up in the heartland, in a large Victorian home built in the 1800s. Given its history, there were several outbuildings and barns that once belonged to the original builder. A highway runs past the property, though it sees maybe 3 cars during the night hours. Directly across from this highway, about 200 feet into a cornfield, stands a mysterious shack. As children, my friends and I would dare each other to venture inside and look around. These challenges always ended with us going as a group safety in numbers. We never found anything particularly scary, just some broken glass, scattered metal pieces, and miscellaneous items. The shack had no electricity or any utilities that might make it habitable. Years passed, and the shack's existence became just another part of my daily life. However, one particular night, as I was watching television, I noticed a light flickering outside my window. After being startled, I dismissed it as passing cars, perhaps more frequent than usual. An hour passed, and it was approaching midnight when the light remained steadily on. I knew for certain it was coming from outside. My family was asleep, but being the nervous 16-year-old I was, I needed confirmation. Unfortunately, no one wanted to investigate with me, so I had to go alone. I grabbed my pocket knife and flashlight, the best protection my panicked mind could think of, and ventured into the night. As I approached the highway, the lights suddenly went out. I had nearly choked on air, but I had to figure out what was going on. I made it to the shack's entrance, which had no door, and slowly began to enter, my flashlight beam scanning the room for any signs of life. What happened next will haunt me forever. 5 feet away from me stood an old, tattered recliner facing away from the entrance. My father had discarded it there for future disposal. I shined my light on it because I could have sworn I saw it rock slightly. As I did, a man suddenly stood up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing some kind of jacket before my survival instincts kicked in. I was already sprinting across the road before I could process what was happening, praying he wasn't following me. The journey to my door felt like an eternity, but as I was about to reach safety, I made the mistake of looking back. He was standing in the middle of the road, completely motionless, maintaining his silence. 7 years have passed since then. The shack still stands, the recliner remains in place, and my dad never believed my story. I wish someone could share the dread I felt when I realized the recliner was facing a window that looked directly into my bedroom. This happened to me about 5 years ago, and even now, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. I was renting a small house in a quiet neighborhood at the time. Nothing fancy, but it was cozy, affordable, and had plenty of character. The only feature I wasn't fond of was the crawl space beneath the house. The access door was in the laundry room, a square wooden hatch flush with the floor, locked from the outside. I never had any reason to open it, assuming it just contained pipes, cobwebs, and whatever else typically lurks in crawl spaces. One evening, I returned home late from work. It had been a particularly stressful day, and all I wanted was to shower and collapse into bed. As I stepped inside, something felt off. My laundry room light was on. I was certain I'd turned it off that morning, but I chalked it up to being absent-minded in my morning rush and switched it off again. That night, I woke around 2 a.m. to a faint noise. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but as I lay there listening, I realized it was coming from the laundry room, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. I debated whether to investigate or just stay in bed and hope it stopped. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed to the laundry room. When I opened the door, everything went quiet, but then I saw it. The hatch to the crawl space was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I distinctly remembered it being locked, and there was no way I could have accidentally opened it. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it might be an animal that had somehow gotten in. I shut the hatch tightly and placed a heavy box of detergent on top before returning to bed. The next day, I called my landlord to ask if there had been any previous issues I should know about. He seemed surprised and said no, one had reported anything like that before. Still, he promised to send someone over to check it out. That night, I double-checked the hatch and even put a chair on top of it for good measure. I didn't hear any noises and started to feel silly for being so freaked out. but at around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I froze. My bedroom door doesn't creak unless you push it very slowly, and I knew I'd closed it before bed. I lay as still as possible, barely breathing, as I heard soft footsteps shuffle into the room. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach. The footsteps stopped right next to my bed. I could feel someone's presence, their quiet breathing in the dark. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swung it toward the intruder. There was a man crouched on the floor, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looked just as startled as I was. I screamed and bolted from the room, running outside to my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until they let me in, and they called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the man still in my house, hiding in the crawl space. He had created a small living space down there, a mattress, some food wrappers, and various items he must have taken from my house. The lock on the hatch had been tampered with, and from the evidence they found, he had been living under my house for at least several days, maybe longer. The most terrifying part: the police found a notebook with detailed notes about me. He had written down my daily routine, when I left for work, when I came home, even what I wore. There was also a list of plans, though they wouldn't tell me what was on it. I moved out the next week and stayed with friends until I found somewhere new to live. To this day, I have no idea how he initially got in, or how long he had been watching me before I noticed something was wrong. The thought that someone could be living beneath your feet, studying your every move, waiting for the right moment, it's the stuff of nightmares. I've had several supernatural experiences throughout my life, but the one I usually share happened during my childhood. Growing up on a fairly isolated farm, our nearest neighbor was separated from us by an acre of fields on one side and a dense wood that came right up to our barn on the other side. Every night after finishing my chores, I'd shut off the barn light and close the door. The only remaining illumination would come from a dim porch light about 40 yards away, and if the weather permitted, the moon and stars. But something always happened during that short walk from the barn to the house. Something that made my blood run cold every single time. I would feel something staring at me from around the corner of the barn. Somehow I knew it had glowing red eyes and towered about 10 feet off the ground. I could feel waves of malevolence radiating from it, and I'd always run to the house as fast as I could, certain it was right behind me. I never told anyone about it when I was young. My parents had a habit of dismissing such things, and even as a kid, I didn't want to be labeled as what my dad would have certainly called a crybaby. As time passed, I convinced myself it was just an overactive imagination combined with reading too many scary stories. That changed about 8 years later, when I was swapping spooky stories with my friend Amanda, who had also grown up on the farm. She mentioned that as soon as the barn lights went off, she always felt something scary and evil staring at her. Before I could say anything, she added, from around the corner of the barn. My heart nearly stopped. I carefully asked a few questions, trying not to lead her responses. Yes, she felt it was about 10 feet off the ground, and even though she never actually saw whatever it was, she was certain it had red eyes. The revelation shook me, but it got even more unsettling when I decided to ask my siblings if they'd ever been scared by anything near the barn. I was careful not to ask leading questions, but every single one of them described the same thing: a terrifying presence that would stare from the corner of the barn when they turned off the light. I know it was just a feeling that we all eventually grew out of, but what are the odds that we all experienced the exact same sensation, from the exact same spot, complete with the same specific details? How many children, over how many years, felt those red eyes watching them from that corner of the barn? Some might say we all just shared the same childhood fear of the dark, but I can't help wondering, what if it wasn't just a feeling? What if something really was watching us all those nights? Something that had claimed that corner of the barn as its own territory. To this day, when I visit the old farm, I still won't go near the barn after dark. This all started around December. I'm not sure if I should contact the police or not, but it's become quite unnerving. I stay at my girlfriend's house on the weekends. She lives on campus at the university in a house with 2 roommates, next door to some friends. One night, I woke up to screaming at 2 in the morning. Now, typically you'd expect to hear screaming on campus from people leaving the bars late at night. But this was different. This was a blood-curdling scream from a young woman calling for her father. She screamed "Dad" at least 4 times. I don't even know how my girlfriend didn't wake up from this. The last scream for her father was more elongated and filled with absolute terror. Then everything went quiet. My heart was pounding. Initially, my girlfriend thought I was just having a bad dream, but that scream was all too real. This experience was terrifying enough on its own, but it wasn't an isolated incident. About 2 months later, her neighbor texted in a group chat asking if anyone had heard the screaming. Then, exactly a week later, another neighbor heard it as well. Almost exactly another week passed, and her friend, who lives a couple of streets down, had roommates texting each other asking if they'd heard the screaming at 2 in the morning. At this point, it seemed clear this could be some sort of luring tactic for human trafficking. Less than a month later, around 11:30 at night, my girlfriend's roommate thought she heard a girl screaming, "Get off." She looked out the window but couldn't see anything. That was the last time anyone heard anything. These events seem very methodically planned, and the fact that my girlfriend lives with 2 other young women in a house without a deadbolt makes it even more concerning. Next time I hear something, I'll definitely document it. I want to try and find the source of the screaming if it happens again. What makes this situation even more bizarre is that she lives right next to a police department. I'm considering calling them soon to report the pattern. The timing, the consistency, and the specific nature of the screams suggest this isn't random. Someone is orchestrating these incidents, but to what end? The screams always happen at the same time, always involve a young woman, and always sound genuinely terrified. Whether it's a cruel prank, an attempt at luring victims, or something else entirely, it's created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in what should be a safe college neighborhood. I do believe in the paranormal and pretty much always have. I've witnessed many apparitions throughout my short life, and my family has numerous stories dealing with various spirits. This particular experience happened on Thanksgiving night. We had just returned home from spending the day at my brother's fiance's house. I wanted to take a shower because it had been a long evening, and I'd been sitting by the fireplace for so long that I smelled strongly of wood smoke. About 5 minutes into my shower, while I was lathering up some shampoo, I noticed a shadowy figure standing right outside the shower curtain. It was approximately 5'9" to 5'10" in height, and just stood there, motionless. I assumed it was my brother stepping in to grab some toilet paper or something similar, so I didn't think too much of it. I continued shampooing my hair and began to rinse off when I noticed the shadow had started to move. It began sliding its way into the shower, right across from me. This time, there wasn't really much of a figure, just an amorphous blob of darkness. I sort of froze at first, but strangely, didn't feel scared or threatened. For some reason, my instincts compelled me to reach out and touch it. Obviously, it had no physical form, so there was no resistance, but it was ice cold. Not long after my touch, it simply vanished. The whole experience left me puzzled rather than frightened. The entity, if that's what it was, didn't seem malevolent. There was almost a sense of curiosity about it, as if it was just as interested in me as I was in it. The most striking thing was the temperature, that bone-chilling cold that seemed to radiate from its presence. I've experienced many paranormal encounters before, but this one was different. Most spirits or entities I've encountered maintain their distance or try to intimidate, but this one seemed almost interactive. The fact that it allowed me to reach out and touch it, even briefly, makes me wonder about its nature. Does anyone have any idea what this might have been? I've researched various types of spiritual manifestations, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The combination of the shadow form, the cold temperature, and its seemingly benign nature makes it unique among paranormal encounters I've heard about. Today, there was a test of the civil defense siren in my region, and the sound brought back a memory I hadn't thought about for years. In my country, it's common for these sirens to be mounted on school buildings, and those few tests each year were always memorable events during my middle school days. At 14, I was like most kids my age, just trying to fit in. For me, that meant attempting to blend in with the school's older alternative crowd. I was taking a creative course, and because the entire school grounds were undergoing renovation, several old buildings were scheduled for demolition. Because of this, my friends and I were essentially given free rein to use these buildings for an art project and the upcoming school fair. We were painting murals on the walls and transforming stairwells into waterfalls, that sort of thing. On this particular day, we were approaching the end of our project. School was finished for the day, so the building was practically empty, and the sirens were scheduled for testing. Interestingly, these sirens, likely dating back to World War II, were mounted on top of the abandoned school building, where everything was about to unfold. Among the alternative kids was this older guy, James, who always struck me as peculiar. The best way to describe him was that he seemed to be constantly performing, pretending to be unpredictable and unstable for attention. Usually, this just meant he was clowning around. He was friends with another guy my age, Danny, who had an obvious and uncomfortable obsession with me. Danny's behavior was a daily nuisance. He would follow me around school, making inappropriate comments and trying to smell my hair. Despite his stalker-like behavior, it never escalated beyond that. James soon joined in on Danny's routine of following me around, and I started skipping school frequently because nobody took my concerns seriously. They thought I was just being dramatic about this comedic duo of pursuers. Even my mother would laugh it off when I complained. Despite them both being creepy and annoying, I felt some sympathy for them. Danny was being bullied for being feminine, even though his behavior toward me clearly showed otherwise. And James, well, I knew he came from a troubled home with a tragic background. That day, I was walking downstairs from where some friends were painting, heading to the empty first floor so I could leave the building. The sirens had started, and they were so deafeningly loud that hearing anything else was impossible, except during the brief pauses between blasts. Suddenly, someone grabbed me before I could reach the exit and forcefully moved me into another hallway where a wall blocked any view from the building's entrance. He held his hands over my mouth as he suddenly pushed me up against the brick wall and lifted me off my feet. When I managed to look at my attacker, I saw it was James, who was significantly taller than my small frame. The sirens were blaring, and he didn't say a word. He just stared at me with completely deranged eyes. Back then, I was so naive that the possibility of real danger didn't immediately register. I nervously laughed and asked him to put me down, but he didn't move. I started to panic as I realized no one could hear me or knew where I was. Just then, before anything could happen, Katie, one of the older alternative girls who was my friend, appeared from around the corner. She had been looking for me, and when she saw what was happening, she didn't hesitate for a second. She marched over, screaming at James, and kicked him as hard as she could in the knee. He dropped me as he crouched down in pain, and Katie grabbed my shoulder and rushed me outside to the schoolyard. After that, we didn't really talk about it. We just called him a creep and tried to laugh it off. During my remaining years in middle school, I gradually drifted away from that crowd as they were all older and moving on to high school. As I've grown older and wiser, I've come to realize just how close I came to something truly terrible happening that day. Because of the sirens, no one would have heard me scream. And in that abandoned building, there were plenty of secluded rooms he could have dragged me into. I'm still so grateful that Katie walked in before anything could happen. Without her, this story might have had a very different ending. Years later, I saw James again in high school. He was dating a friend of a friend who was a year younger than me, making her about 16 while he was 19. He would often wait around the school grounds for her to finish classes, and even though I tried avoiding him, he once ran up and hugged me. I felt completely uncomfortable and just froze. Later, I told my friend about him, and she revealed that he was abusive to her friend. I work in a care home in the northwest of England, and I work nights. I thought I'd share some of the ghostly encounters I've experienced, because the spirits at work seem to take particular delight in scaring me senseless. I used to work evenings, and it started with just footsteps behind me, particularly when I was alone. Then they started scratching my head and tapping it. When I switched to night shifts, certain spirits began appearing that all night staff have witnessed. One night about a year ago, I was walking down a staircase. To my right was a corridor that led to a dead end. I glanced down the corridor and saw a figure. She was almost luminescent. She was so white. She had no face and very straggly hair. She was peeping out of a bathroom doorway, and I could only see her head and upper body. Although she had no face, I could feel her watching me. I turned to call for my coworkers, but when I looked back, she was gone. She doesn't bother me too much. She seems like a benign spirit, and I've never worried about seeing her again. Another spirit is what staff call the shadow man. He lurks behind people and in corners. He only gets very close to one staff member, who I regularly work with. I've only seen him once, in front of the entrance. We both froze, just staring at each other. One night, myself and this particular coworker were doing the cleaning in the corridor, with all the living rooms. We were standing there having a rant about general annoyances. For context, the spirits never seemed to like us being negative. As we were complaining, all the living rooms started making incredibly loud noises simultaneously. I felt brave and told them to shut up. I turned away from the noise, and my coworker told me the shadow man was behind me. I didn't look, so I'm not sure if he was really there, but the noise quieted down because we'd stopped our discussion. When we started complaining again, the noise resumed as well. Other encounters include hearing a man shout, "Help me." When there was no man around, we were in a corridor filled with sleeping women. Another time, I was walking out of the kitchen when all the cutlery started clattering around by itself. We often see people sitting in chairs in our peripheral vision, but when we look directly at them, nobody's there. Then there's the whistling that happens so close to us, but we have to pretend not to hear it because it feels deeply wrong. Once I was sitting alone in the staff room when something whispered my name right in my ear. When I'm in the laundry room, I can hear things in the corridor like walking frames moving, even when all residents are asleep. Another time, there was screaming upstairs, and we couldn't locate the source. It was like when we went to one end of a corridor, there would be a scream from the opposite side, and then we'd go back and forth without ever finding who was screaming. During another shift, we were sitting in the staff room around 5 in the morning when we heard the distinct sound of a walking stick in the corridor. We went out to check if someone was awake. They weren't. One night, myself and another care worker were assisting a resident when I started hearing banging noises. My coworker didn't hear it at first, so I ignored it and attributed it to an overactive imagination. The sound began getting louder, and I turned to my coworker and suggested someone must be breaking in. She told me to look out the front window. As there's a view of the main entrance, nobody was there. Again, I tried to ignore it, but when we left this particular room and passed the bathroom where I'd previously seen the peeping woman, the door was closed. Suddenly, the door started banging violently and shaking. We ran back down the corridor, both terrified. All alarms were active on doors, so we knew no resident was awake. I still have no idea what was in that bathroom. Another night, I was on shift again, walking down that same corridor with a staff member. We had done our hourly checks on all residents when we suddenly started hearing a woman's voice repeating, "Help me, help me, help me," on a loop. At first, we thought it was a resident and immediately rechecked all rooms. Nobody was awake, but we could still hear the pleas for help. After checking the rooms, we listened more carefully and realized we didn't recognize the voice. We didn't leave each other's side for the rest of the night. I left the care home temporarily about 3 months ago, and can return at any point, but it's just too scary. I've always wondered about the nature of these entities in the home and how aware they are of their surroundings. I don't like that they know my name and seem to target night staff specifically. I've been experiencing paranormal activity recently, and I need to know if anyone else has encountered anything similar. It started with footsteps quiet at first, barely noticeable, but they would follow me around the house, always just behind me. Then came the head scratching and gentle tapping, like someone trying to get my attention. After I moved to night shifts, the encounters became more intense. One night, around 3 a.m, I was walking down my hallway when I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor, a woman, but not quite human. She seemed to glow from within, her form almost translucent. Her face was completely smooth, featureless, with long, stringy hair that seemed to move of its own accord. She was leaning out from my bathroom doorway, only her upper body visible. Though she had no eyes, I could feel her watching me intently. I turned to call out to my roommate, but when I looked back, she had vanished. Strangely, this entity doesn't frighten me much. She seems curious rather than malevolent, and I've never felt threatened by her presence. However, there's another presence in the house that the others and I call the Dark Watcher. It lurks in corners and shadows, following certain people more than others. My roommate Lisa seems to be its favorite target. I've only seen it once directly, standing in our front entrance. We both froze, locked in a silent standoff, before it melted back into the darkness. One evening, Lisa and I were cleaning the living room, complaining about our jobs and general life frustrations. Suddenly, every electronic device in the room began making noise simultaneously. The TV turned itself on. The radio started blasting static. Even our phones began ringing with no incoming calls. In a moment of either bravery or foolishness, I told whatever it was to be quiet. When I turned around, Lisa's face had gone pale. She said the Dark Watcher was standing right behind me. I refused to look, but the cacophony of noise ceased immediately. These aren't isolated incidents. Strange things happen constantly now. Sometimes I hear a man's voice calling for help when I'm alone in the house. The kitchen is particularly active. Pots and pans will clatter in empty cabinets. Silverware rearranges itself when no one's looking. We frequently glimpse people sitting in our peripheral vision, but they vanish when we turn to look directly at them. The whistling is perhaps the most unnerving. It happens right next to our ears, a clear, distinct tune that feels wrong somehow. Not quite musical, not quite natural. We've learned to ignore it, because acknowledging it seems to make things worse. Once, while I was alone in my bedroom, something whispered my name so close to my ear that I felt the breath on my skin. In the laundry room, I often hear the sound of someone walking with a cane, tap, tap, tapping down the hallway. But when I check, the hallway is always empty, and all the doors are still locked. Last week, we heard screaming coming from upstairs. We searched every room, but the screams seemed to move. When we'd check one end of the house, they'd come from the other. We never found the source. Just last night, while folding laundry, I started hearing strange banging noises. My roommate couldn't hear them at first, so I tried to ignore it, but they kept getting louder and more insistent. We checked all the windows and doors, thinking someone might be trying to break in, but found nothing. As we passed the bathroom, the same one where I'd first seen the glowing woman, the door began shaking violently, the knob rattling as if someone was trying to get out. We ran, and when we finally gathered the courage to check again, the bathroom was empty, but ice cold. Later that same night, we were doing our usual house check before bed when we heard a woman's voice repeating, "Help me," over and over, like a recording stuck on loop. We searched every room twice, but found nothing. The voice wasn't familiar. It didn't belong to anyone we knew, living or dead. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too scared to separate. I've considered moving out, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe whatever these entities are have somehow bound me to this place. I can't help but wonder about their nature. Are they conscious? Do they know who and what they are? And why do they seem to know my name, to recognize me specifically? These questions keep me awake at night, even as the footsteps echo down my hallway and the whistling starts again. All right, I've made comments about this encounter before, but I'm finally ready to share the full story. I'm pretty convinced what I saw was one of those creatures people call crawlers. Let me set the scene. I lived in a suburb of Minneapolis that's surrounded by dense forest. About 6 or 7 years ago, we experienced what meteorologists called a polar vortex, where temperatures plunged to -30 degrees for a week. This didn't happen during the vortex itself, but right after, when it was still bitterly cold. My backyard door is elevated, with a small platform that provides a clear view into most of the neighboring yards. It was around 2 in the morning, and I had just finished watching a movie. I stepped outside for a final cigarette before bed, into air so cold it felt like it could freeze your lungs. The moment I stepped outside, I heard this bizarre scratching and banging noise. Looking over, I spotted something 2 houses down in my neighbor's backyard that I still struggle to explain. It was this strange, humanoid creature with light gray skin, moving around on all fours. It appeared to be trying to get into my neighbor's garage, attempting to lift the door and wedge itself underneath. If it had stood upright, I estimate it would have been 5 to 6 feet tall, but it was hard to tell with the way it moved. I stood there frozen, watching it for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a minute or 2, before retreating inside and locking the door. I peered out of my window, continuing to observe it. After another minute of unsuccessfully trying to breach the garage door, it suddenly slammed itself against it and then scuttled away. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen, sort of like a crab, but with unnaturally long limbs and jerky, inhuman movements. I don't typically believe in supernatural creatures or cryptids, but this thing was undeniably real. When I describe it to people, they often suggest it might have been a person with a medical condition, or maybe someone under the influence of drugs. But the temperature that night was dangerously cold. No human could have survived being outside in those conditions wearing no clothes, let alone moving with such agility. The creature's skin had an almost translucent quality to it, like it had never been exposed to sunlight. Its movements were too fluid, too quick for its size, and there was something about its presence that felt deeply wrong, as if it didn't belong in our reality. I've since learned that others in the area have reported similar sightings, especially during extreme weather conditions. Some suggest these creatures are more active during severe cold snaps, using the weather as cover since fewer people are likely to be outside. Whether that's true or not, I know what I saw that night was real, and it wasn't human. I'm afraid of roads now at 21 years old, all because of an encounter that happened 8 years ago. This might sound overly traumatic considering how much time has passed, but I want to share my experience. Maybe it can help others stay alert to similar dangers, or at least recognize the warning signs I missed. I live in rural Ohio, in an area that's not exactly prime real estate. We have our fair share of drug addicts and registered offenders of varying degrees. It's definitely not the kind of place you'd want to raise kids. But growing up, we didn't worry much about danger. My grandfather had been a well-respected police officer for many years, and people knew he would fight tooth and nail to protect us. Nobody really messed with our family. We lived around multiple other children our age, and it wasn't uncommon for kids to run around unsupervised before nightfall. Our neighborhood operated on a sort of collective surveillance system. Everyone watched out for everyone else's children, and it worked for the most part. We knew which people to avoid, and they knew to stay away from us. When I was in middle school, the bus ran at 7 in the morning, and we had to be at the end of our long driveway to catch it. During winter, the buses often ran late, sometimes arriving between 7:05 and 7:15. But we always made sure to be out at 7 sharp, just in case they were on time. It was myself and my 2 cousins waiting that morning. One was 4 years younger than me, and the other was a year older, but in the same grade. The road where our driveway ended was straight, so you could see cars coming from quite a distance. We'd been taught never to stand right at the end of the driveway, always keeping our distance in case a drunk driver or someone else swerved off the road. By then, my older cousin and I were essentially babysitting the younger one, and we no longer had an adult accompanying us at the bus stop. It was bitterly cold that day, and the sun was just starting to rise. We were annoyed because the bus was running late, leaving us standing in the freezing air. I noticed a car approaching, which wasn't unusual, so I didn't pay much attention at first. But then I heard a loud braking sound. Looking up, I saw the car had stopped directly in front of our driveway. The man inside was waving his hand, gesturing for us to come closer. I froze in place, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. The man must have noticed our hesitation, because he called out that he worked for a school, but was lost. He named a school that was an hour away. Even at that age, the story made no sense to me. It was past 7 in the morning. Why would a teacher be lost an hour away from their school? How could he be this lost from a job he claimed he'd already started? The location he mentioned was so far away that he would have had to pass numerous other schools to reach our area. I immediately told him I was going to get an adult. He visibly panicked, insisting it wasn't necessary, that he just wanted us to come closer and give him directions. I pointed straight ahead. I didn't actually know the way to the district he mentioned, but direction giving wasn't my priority at that moment. He ignored my gesture, and to my horror, my younger cousin started moving toward his car. I grabbed my little cousin by his hair refusing to let go. I was shaking, but trying not to show my fear, because I didn't know what this man might do. The driveway was long, and I didn't feel safe turning my back on him. With my other hand, I fumbled with my phone, struggling with my gloves in the cold, but managed to call my mom. Thank God she answered. She usually ignored my calls when she was on the phone with her boyfriend. The man got out of his car when he saw I was on the phone with someone, and I immediately began sobbing, telling my mom there was a man outside, and that I thought he was going to hurt us. She came running out, and the second she got closer and he saw her, he bolted back to his car and sped away. What's even more frightening is that another car that had been just around the corner of the road also raced away. Looking back, it's even more terrifying to realize that if the second car had simply been trying to pass the first one, which was stopped in the middle of the road, they could have easily used the other lane or honked. Instead, they sat there watching the entire scene unfold, never attempting to help us or pass by. They were clearly involved in whatever this man had planned. I was forced to go to school that day, and my mom called the police. When I got home, I learned something that confirmed my worst fears. My mom had described the car to the police, and they found an abandoned vehicle matching her description just up the road. They traced the owner and discovered he wasn't a teacher at all. He worked on river barges. The police believed it was related to human trafficking. They never caught him since he'd already left on the boat. Who knows what would have happened if he had managed to get one of us into his car? We likely would have ended up on that boat, and then, I don't even want to think about it. It still infuriates me that he was never caught, and that other children might have become his victims. To this day, I refuse to go near the road. I still have recurring nightmares about it, and I'm always on high alert now. I should have been more careful back then, but I was just a kid and didn't realize how it would affect me in the long term. Looking back, all the signs were there: the suspicious story, the second car waiting around the corner, the way he panicked when I mentioned getting an adult. I hope sharing this story might help others recognize similar danger signs before it's too late. I guess I'll start by saying that I do believe in the paranormal, and pretty much always have. I've encountered many apparitions throughout my life, and my family has numerous stories about various supernatural experiences. However, this particular incident stands out as uniquely disturbing. Thanksgiving night, we had just returned home from spending the day at my brother's fiance's house. After sitting by their fireplace all evening, I desperately needed a shower to wash away the persistent smell of wood smoke. What happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about reality. I had just started shampooing my hair when I noticed a shadowy figure standing right outside the shower curtain. It was about 5'9" to 5'10" in height and remained perfectly still. Initially, I assumed it was my brother needing to grab something from the bathroom, so I didn't think much of it. I continued washing my hair and began to rinse when I noticed the shadow had begun to move. It started sliding into the shower, positioning itself directly across from me. At this point, it wasn't really a distinct figure anymore, more like an amorphous blob of darkness. Strangely, while I froze initially, I didn't feel scared or threatened. Something compelled me to reach out and touch it. As expected, it had no physical form, My hand passed right through it, but the space it occupied was ice cold. Shortly after my touch, it simply vanished. The experience left me more puzzled than frightened. Whatever this entity was, it didn't seem malevolent. There was almost a sense of mutual curiosity, as if it was just as interested in examining me as I was in understanding it. The most striking aspect was the intense cold that radiated from its presence, not just cool, but a bone-chilling cold that seemed to defy the steam-filled bathroom air. I've experienced many paranormal encounters before, but this one was different. Most spirits or entities I've encountered maintain their distance or attempt to intimidate, but this one seemed almost interactive. The fact that it allowed me to reach out and touch it, even briefly, makes me wonder about its nature and purpose. I've researched various types of spiritual manifestations, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The combination of the shadow form, the intense cold, and its seemingly benign nature makes it unique among paranormal encounters I've heard about. Does anyone have any idea what this might have been? I had just left my apartment complex and was heading to a friend's place. Pulling out of my driveway and up to the traffic light, I stopped in the left turn lane. The light was red, and there weren't many people on the road as it was quite late. I watched as the light turned yellow and then red for through traffic. One car ran the tail end of the yellow, as people often do. Then it was my turn. The light turned green, and I had a blinking arrow indicating I could turn left. I looked both ways, saw no one around, and yet I didn't go. I cannot explain what happened other than something deep inside me just said, "Don't go." So I sat there, staring at the green light. A couple of seconds later, a car came screaming through the red light through the intersection, probably doing about 60 miles per hour in the lane I would have been turning into. They were going so fast, their vehicle was actually bouncing off the ground. If I had turned when my light went green, my car would have been demolished, and I would have been killed instantly. I sat there through the whole next light cycle, then turned, pulled over, and called my sister. It was the strangest feeling, like something or someone had taken control for just a moment to save my life. What makes this experience even more remarkable is that I'm typically an impatient driver. Yes, I look both ways, but I'm usually quick to go when I have the right of way. I cannot explain what stopped me from going the second that light went green, but I'm incredibly grateful for whatever it was. The feeling I had in that moment wasn't exactly fear or anxiety. It was more like an absolutely unshakable certainty that I needed to wait. It wasn't a conscious decision. It felt more like an instinct or a command from somewhere deep in my subconscious. The strange thing is, I didn't even feel frustrated about waiting, which is completely out of character for me. I've heard people talk about guardian angels or protective spirits, and while I've never been particularly religious or spiritual, this experience made me wonder. Was it just incredibly good luck? A random firing of neurons that happened to save my life? Or was there something more to it? Some kind of protective force that knew what was coming and kept me safe? Whatever it was, that moment changed how I think about driving and decision-making in general. Sometimes our instincts, or that little voice inside, knows things we couldn't possibly know consciously. I've learned to pay attention to those feelings, even if I can't explain them rationally. This story didn't happen to me, but to a very close male friend I've known for 7 years. We were hanging out with a couple of other friends, sharing creepy experiences, when he told this tale from his perspective. He was 16 years old at the time, living in Portland, Oregon. Despite his young age, he was already quite tall at 6 feet 3 inches and weighed about 190 pounds. While his size made him look intimidating, he wasn't the type to start trouble unless provoked. One day after school, feeling restless and bored at home, he decided to go downtown to browse some music stores and gaming shops. He wanted to save money, so he planned to take the bus, but first needed to catch a taxi to the bus stop, which was about a 10-minute drive away. When he flagged down a taxi, a light-skinned man with black, greasy hair pulled over. The driver wore a worn-out dark green shirt and jeans, and appeared to be in his early 30s. Through the passenger window, the driver asked his destination. When my friend explained he needed to get to the bus stop for downtown, the driver made an unusual offer. "Well, I can take you downtown if you like. I'm going to pass by that area anyway. I can drop you there, no charge." This should have raised red flags, but my friend thought the man was just being kind. Not wanting to deal with multiple transportation changes, he decided to accept the ride. Looking back now, he realizes this was a massive mistake. There are several routes to downtown, and my friend only knew a couple of them. As they drove, the driver began taking unfamiliar streets. Still, no alarm bells rang. My friend assumed he was taking a shortcut to avoid traffic. But after 20 minutes had passed, unease began to set in. Usually, from the bus route he took, it was only about 20 minutes to downtown, even in heavy traffic. Then the driver spoke in an unsettling, yet calm tone. "Hey, do you mind if I use your phone? I want to see if you've got any videos or music I can send via Bluetooth." This strange request made my friend uncomfortable, but since the man was giving him a free ride and there was nothing private on his phone, he handed it over, not wanting to seem impolite. The driver played with the phone briefly, before placing both my friend's phone and his own in the empty space under the driver's door handle. Doubt began creeping in, and my friend felt vulnerable without his phone. Yet he tried to silence his concerns and stared out the window. The feeling of dread only grew as he realized he couldn't recognize where they were anymore. They were now on empty roads with only desert on either side, broken up by occasional rusty shipping containers. As darkness began falling, things got even more sinister. The driver picked up his phone and started shouting angrily at someone on the other end. "I'm coming to fuck you up. You better prepare yourself because I'm coming to beat you up, you son of a bitch." As soon as the call ended, my friend knew something was terribly wrong. Looking more closely at the phone the driver had used, he realized it was an old model that didn't even have Bluetooth capability. Alarm bells started ringing loudly in his head. He asked for his phone back, growing nervous with each word. The driver gave him a strange, annoyed look and said, "I just wanted to see what you got on your phone." By this point, my friend had had enough. He demanded his phone back, anger and fear barely contained in his voice. The driver hesitantly complied after some back and forth muttering. Feeling the rush of adrenaline, My friend decided to create a scenario where there was an emergency at home. He pretended to be talking to his parents and told the driver he needed to return home immediately, demanding to be let out right there as he spotted an upcoming traffic light. This was his only chance of escape. He wasn't going to wait around to find out where this man was really taking him. As they stopped at the traffic light, my friend spoke in his most intimidating voice, telling the driver to open the passenger door. Fortunately, there were a couple of cars stopped next to them. The driver responded with a menacing look, but pressed the unlock button. My friend got out of that car faster than he'd ever moved in his life and ran straight to a small, rundown coffee shop in the middle of nowhere. As the taxi sped off, he went inside and asked the server, out of breath and sweating, if downtown was nearby. The server looked at him with a confused and irritated expression and said, "You know you're not even in Portland anymore, right? You're heading towards Seattle." My friend called his parents to pick him up from the middle of nowhere, swearing he'd never take another taxi to get back home or anywhere else. Thinking about it later, he realized the driver had planned to kidnap him from the start, trying to take away his phone so he couldn't call for help. The fake phone call was likely a way to secretly message accomplices that he was getting close. So to that greasy-haired taxi driver with evil intentions, let's hope we never meet again. In January of this year, when marijuana was still technically illegal in Germany, but enforcement in Berlin was already quite relaxed, I found myself in a situation that could have ended very differently. While you wouldn't typically get arrested for smoking in public, as long as you weren't bothering anyone, I'd been a daily smoker for years and preferred the comfort of my own home. I can function pretty well while high, but I rarely smoke in public, partly to avoid trouble, but mostly because I enjoy the security of my apartment. One late night around 3 in the morning, I was chatting online with friends, ready to call it a day. I wanted to relax with a joint and one of my favorite shows, but realized I had no snacks left. Determined to end the night with a proper munchie session, I decided to visit a nearby late-night shop, similar to a convenience store, but locally called a Speddy. At that hour, only the sketchiest ones remain open, often operating in a legal gray area. I grabbed my coat and keys, but then had what seemed like a brilliant idea at the time. Why not make this cold walk more enjoyable? I rolled a small joint and lit it as I stepped outside into the freezing night air. The area I live in is pretty rough, primarily populated by immigrant communities, many from Middle Eastern countries. Poor integration has led to increased crime and occasional violence. Even so, I was in good spirits as I strolled toward the flickering neon sign of the Speddy. Just one more intersection to go. A group of men stood at the corner. They appeared Middle Eastern, slightly older than me, and watched intently as I walked past. It felt normal enough, nothing to worry about, I thought, already slightly high as I crossed the street. Then I heard a voice call out, "Routine ID check, please show me your identification." My heart sank. Of course this would happen the one time I smoke in public, I thought, turning to face the police. Except they weren't police at all. It was the group from the intersection, now slowly approaching me. "Routine ID check, please show me your ID." "We're undercover cops," one of them said with a smug grin. I froze, The fact that they weren't actual police became crystal clear when none of them produced any law enforcement identification despite their demands. "You know smoking weed is illegal, don't you?" the man continued. His pupils were enormous, like black saucers in the dim light. It was obvious these guys had no authority whatsoever. They began circling me. "Show us what's in your pockets," the leader demanded. So it's a robbery, I thought. As long as I don't resist, maybe I'll only lose my phone and the few euros I brought for snacks. Then a wave of dread hit me. My weekly tips, about 300 euros in cash, were also in my pocket. I'd forgotten to deposit them earlier. Losing that money would devastate my tight budget for the month. What now? As I slowly reached into my pocket, the leader pressed me. "What's taking so long?" I pulled out an old pack of gum and some broken headphones, hoping to satisfy them. "Where's your wallet?" "I need your ID," he insisted. Still fumbling, too stubborn and stupid to hand over my tips, I inadvertently noticed something that shocked me: the glint of a pistol tucked into his belt. Knives and metal rods were typical weapons in this area, but a gun. That was insane, even by local standards. German gun laws are incredibly strict. My adrenaline spiked. Slowly, I pulled out the €5 bill I'd planned to use for snacks, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You've got no wallet," he growled, his face darkening. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, before this escalated further. Then a desperate thought flashed through my mind. The people in this area had a well-known fear of Russians, with frequent clashes between the two groups. Maybe, just maybe, I could use this to my advantage. In a heavy Russian accent, I stammered, "My friend has my wallet. They're coming soon. We meet here." To my surprise, their poor English comprehension worked in my favor. They exchanged glances, muttering in German, apparently deciding whether to wait. I forced myself to look confused, maintaining the bluff. It worked. Their effort to translate or figure me out must have seemed like too much trouble. The leader finally pointed at my €5 bill. "All right then, you get us something to drink." Reluctantly, I followed them into the Spedi. They grabbed a six-pack of cola, and I paid, heart-pounding. I was certain this wasn't over, that they'd either search me themselves or retaliate when my non-existent friends didn't show up. But then, just like that, they left. No violence, no further questions, nothing. I stood there in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Looking back, I can't believe I bluffed in such a dangerous situation. It could have been my last day on Earth, all over 300 euros. I've learned my lesson these days. I avoid walking around late at night when the streets are empty. And to those guys from that night, let's never meet again. I've been wanting to share this story for a while now, though my hands still shake slightly whenever I think about those 3 terrifying nights. It happened just a few months ago, during the coldest part of winter in the outskirts of Portland. I'm a web designer, and I've always preferred working during the night. There's something peaceful about those quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps, and I can focus entirely on my projects. My schedule usually runs from 7 in the evening until around 10 in the morning, even on my days off. It helps me maintain a consistent rhythm, and I've grown to love the solitude that comes with being awake while others dream. That first night, I was wrapping up a particularly challenging project for a client in Tokyo. The clock on my desktop showed 4:15 in the morning when I finally sent the last email. The winter air was crisp and clear as I walked out to my porch, taking a moment to admire how the moonlight painted everything in shades of silver. That's when I noticed it. A dark blue Volvo, probably from the early 90s, parked right next to my driveway. My house sits on the eastern slope of Mount Tabor, with enough space between properties that parking isn't usually an issue. The street has plenty of spots, which made it odd that someone would choose to park so close to my driveway. The car's windows were tinted so heavily, they appeared almost black in the moonlight. I stood there for a moment, trying to peer inside, but couldn't make out anything beyond my own reflection. Initially, I brushed it off. Maybe someone was visiting the Williams family next door. They sometimes hosted late-night gaming sessions for their teenage son. I went inside, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and settled in for my usual morning routine of watching an episode of my favorite show before bed. When I checked again an hour later, the Volvo was gone. The next day passed normally. I woke up around 6 in the evening, made dinner, and started my work routine. The incident with the car had already faded to the back of my mind. The night was particularly beautiful, with the kind of clarity you only get after a cold front moves through, leaving the stars twinkling like diamonds scattered across black velvet. But when I finished work the next morning, there it was again, the same dark blue Volvo, parked in exactly the same spot. This time, something felt different. Wrong. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I parked my car in the garage, but didn't get out immediately. Instead, I sat there, watching the Volvo through my rearview mirror, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Finally, gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight, walking slowly down my driveway. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, seeming unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn silence. As I approached the car, I could have sworn I saw movement behind those tinted windows, just a slight shift, like someone adjusting in their seat. I stopped about 10 feet away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The beam of my flashlight reflected off the windows, making it impossible to see inside. Before retreating, I quickly snapped a photo of the license plate. Better safe than sorry, I thought. Just like the night before, when I checked an hour later, the car was gone. But this time, the unsettling feeling lingered. I double-checked all my doors and windows before going to bed, something I rarely did in my quiet neighborhood. The next evening was my night off. I tried to stick to my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 8, I decided to take my usual walk around the neighborhood. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in white puffs as I walked beneath the bare winter trees. The Volvo wasn't there when I left, but something told me to hurry back. My intuition was right. When I returned from my hour-long walk, the car had reappeared, sitting there like a dark sentinel. This time I marched straight up to it, anger temporarily overwhelming my fear. I pressed my face against the driver's side window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the reflections. The car was empty, completely empty. No personal items, no signs of life at all. just pristine upholstery that looked almost new despite the car's age. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was condensation on the inside of the windows, as if someone had been breathing in there recently. I practically ran back to my house, grabbing my phone from where I'd left it charging. There was a notification waiting for me motion, detected on one of my security cameras. I have several cameras set up around my house, one facing the front door and 3 inside covering the main areas. The notification didn't specify which camera had been triggered. With trembling fingers, I opened the app. There was a 60-second clip waiting for me. The footage started normally enough. Just my quiet, empty bedroom illuminated by the soft glow of my bedside lamp. For most of the video, nothing happened. Then, in the final 5 seconds, something moved across the bottom of the frame. It was quick, just a glimpse of dark hair and the curve of a shoulder, but it was enough. Someone was in my house. The silence suddenly seemed deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft hum of the heating system, and was that a creak from upstairs? My eyes darted around the room, searching every shadow, every potential hiding place. The knowledge that someone had been in my bedroom, my private space, made me feel violated in a way I'd never experienced before. I knew I needed to get out, but my body seemed frozen in place. When I finally managed to move, I heard its footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Then they started moving faster, coming toward the stairs. I ran. The front door seemed miles away, but somehow I reached it, my fingers fumbling with the lock for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, practically on top of me now. Finally, the door opened, and I burst out into the cold night air, running toward the woods behind my house. I didn't stop until I couldn't run anymore, my lungs burning from the frigid air. With shaking hands, I called 911. When the police arrived, the Volvo was gone, but I still had the photo of the license plate. It only took them 3 hours to find him. A 30-year-old former IT specialist named Thomas Walker. His phone contained dozens of photos of me sitting in my living room, working at my desk, even sleeping. He had detailed notes about my schedule, going back almost 3 weeks. The police never figured out how he managed to get around my security cameras all those times. Given the methodical nature of his stalking, they suspect he had been watching me long enough to learn their blind spots. The thought that he might have been in my house multiple times before that final night still keeps me awake sometimes. They found specialized hacking equipment in his apartment, along with detailed plans of my house's layout and security system. He had been using his IT knowledge to periodically disable individual cameras, creating windows of opportunity to enter my home undetected. The forensic analysis of my security system revealed multiple instances of sophisticated tampering. Walker is in custody now, facing multiple charges. I've since moved to a new house, installed a much more sophisticated security system, and changed my work schedule. But sometimes, when I'm up late working, I still find myself checking the driveway, making sure there isn't a dark car waiting in the shadows. Some experiences change you forever, I suppose. At least I'm here to tell the story. After 15 years on the police force, I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that would make my palms sweat and my heart race quite like this one did. But life has a way of surprising you, even when you think you've seen it all. I had been driving for Lyft for about 6 months, picking up extra cash during my off days from my security consulting business. There's something peaceful about driving through the Colorado mountains, especially during those quiet hours when the world seems to stand still. That night, though, was different. The fog had rolled in thick and heavy, the kind that seems to swallow everything in its path. It was the sort of night where most drivers would call it quits, but I had always been stubborn about sticking to my commitments. Besides, the mountain folks still needed rides, weather be damned. I was parked in an empty lot near Idaho Springs, watching the fog dance in my headlights while listening to an old jazz station. The dashboard clock read 11:45 when the notification came through. A pickup request from a location 25 minutes away, with a destination even further into the mountains. Under normal circumstances, I might have declined. The location was up one of those remote mountain roads that twisted through the darkness like a serpent. But something, call it curiosity, call it foolishness, made me accept the ride. As I navigated through the fog-shrouded roads, the world outside seemed to disappear entirely, leaving nothing but an ethereal white void beyond my headlights. The GPS led me deeper into the wilderness, past the last vestiges of civilization, until I reached a crossroads marked only by an ancient-looking stop sign. According to the app, this was the pickup point, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just endless walls of white fog and the dark silhouettes of pine trees looming like silent sentinels. I marked myself as arrived and waited, engine idling, heater fighting against the mountain chill. The radio signal had long since faded to static, leaving me in unsettling silence. That's when I saw him in my rearview mirror, a figure emerging from the fog like a ghost. He moved with an odd, purposeful gait, and before I could process where he'd come from, he was opening the back door. The man who slid into my car was soaking wet, despite there being no rain. He wore dark clothes that clung to his frame, and his face bore an expression that sent my old cop instincts into overdrive. "You must be Mike," he said, using my name from the app. His voice was soft, but had an edge to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I noticed he chose to sit directly behind me, rather than on the passenger side, where most solo riders preferred to sit. I started driving, following the GPS deeper into the mountain wilderness. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each passing mile, and an uncomfortable silence filled the car. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I caught him staring intently at me, only to quickly look away. After about 10 minutes of this unsettling dance, I decided to break the ice. My police training had taught me that engaging in conversation could often reveal valuable information about a person's state of mind. "Pretty unusual spot for a pickup," I said, keeping my tone casual, "especially on a night like this." His eyes met mine in the mirror, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face, something that reminded me of suspects I'd interviewed in interrogation rooms. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The road ahead narrowed, climbing higher into the mountains. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. We passed a sign warning of sharp curves, the metal reflection of my headlights creating an eerie glow in the whiteness. Suddenly, his voice cut through the silence. "Stop here." The words came out sharp, almost like a command rather than a request. I hesitated, my internal alarm bells ringing at full volume now. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest and that impenetrable fog. My phone's signal had disappeared miles ago. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "The destination's still about 15 minutes ahead." I said, "Stop here." His tone had changed, becoming harder, more insistent. In the mirror, I could see him leaning forward slightly, his eyes now fixed on my phone mounted on the dashboard, displaying the Lyft app with his full name and ride details. Something in his expression changed when he saw the screen, a flash of realization, perhaps even fear. He must have remembered that the app had his information, that this ride could be traced back to him. Making a split-second decision, I pulled over slowly, my right hand casually dropping to the spot where I kept my old service weapon concealed under the seat. "No problem," I said, trying to sound relaxed. "I'll just cancel the ride from my end, no charge." He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes darting between my phone and the back of my head. The tension in the car was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the fog. I watched in my mirrors as his figure dissolved into the white nothingness, my hand still gripping my weapon. Only when I was certain he was gone did I allow myself to breathe normally again. I turned the car around and drove back down the mountain as fast as was safe in the conditions, not stopping until I reached the well-lit parking lot of the Idaho Springs Police Station. I reported the incident immediately, providing them with all the information from the app. 3 days later, I received a call that chilled me to the bone. A hiker had been reported missing that night last seen near the trailhead, just off the road, where I'd picked up my mysterious passenger. The investigation revealed that my passenger's account had been created using stolen information. Despite an extensive search of the area, neither the missing hiker nor my passenger was ever found. The fog that night had erased any traces that might have been left behind. Sometimes, during my late-night drives through the mountains, I find myself thinking about that night, about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed him looking at my phone, if I hadn't had my police training, if I hadn't been armed. The mountains hold many secrets, and I suspect this one will remain untold. The incident changed how I approach rideshare driving. I no longer accept pickups in remote locations, and I've installed additional security cameras in my car. But more than that, it reminded me that even after years of police work, there are still things in this world that can catch you off guard. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just slips quietly into your back seat on a foggy night in the mountains. Living alone never bothered me much until that night. My lakeside house in northern Minnesota had always been a sanctuary, a place where I could decompress after long days at the veterinary clinic. But sometimes, the things we find most comforting can become the source of our greatest fears. The day had been particularly draining. 3 emergency surgeries and a steady stream of worried pet owners had left me exhausted. By the time I finished my shift at 6, The snow had already been falling steadily for hours. The weather forecast had predicted one of the worst storms of the season, and for once, they weren't exaggerating. The drive home took twice as long as usual. My headlights carved through the swirling snow, and the wind howled around my truck like a living thing. As I turned onto the private road leading to my house, I noticed something odd, a fresh set of tire tracks in the snow. They led straight to my house before turning around and heading back out. My property sits at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by pine forest on 3 sides and overlooking Lake Superior on the 4th. It's the kind of isolation I'd always appreciated, but at that moment, those mysterious tracks made me question my choice of location. I pulled into my garage, noting that whoever had visited hadn't left any packages or mail at my door. Inside, I changed out of my clinic clothes and heated up some leftover lasagna. The wind had picked up considerably, making the old windows rattle in their frames. I was just settling into my favorite armchair with dinner when I heard it, a soft knock. So quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The sound came from the front door, barely audible over the storm. I set my plate down and walked through the darkness of my living room, past the stone fireplace that divided the space. When I opened the door, I was hit with a blast of Arctic air and stinging snow. The motion-activated porch light illuminated nothing but white particles dancing in the wind. I closed the door quickly, attributing the sound to a branch hitting the house or my mind playing tricks on me. The heating system hummed steadily, fighting against the below-zero temperatures outside. I returned to my chair and tried to focus on the documentary I'd been watching while scrolling through my phone. About an hour passed before I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There on my pristine white tile floor was a small puddle of melted snow. It was just behind my armchair, in a spot I wouldn't have been able to see while sitting down. I knew I hadn't tracked it in. I'd removed my boots in the garage. And besides, this spot was nowhere near my path from the door. I grabbed a paper towel and wiped up the water, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had dripped from my clothes earlier. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The puddle was fresh, the water still cold. Something wasn't adding up, and for the first time, I began to feel truly uneasy in my own home. The layout of my house suddenly felt like a liability. The open concept first floor meant that anyone standing behind my chair would have a clear view of me, while I'd have no idea they were there. The wall-mounted TV faced my chair, and its screen reflected only darkness behind me. Every few minutes, I found myself turning around, checking the shadows, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation became so overwhelming that I decided to retreat upstairs to my bedroom. At least there, with my back against the headboard, I would know nothing could sneak up behind me. I had a smaller TV mounted on the wall, and I figured I could salvage what remained of my evening from the safety of my bed. I'd been up there for maybe 20 minutes when I heard a muffled thump from somewhere outside my bedroom door. It wasn't a dramatic sound, just the soft impact of something against the wall, or perhaps a footstep on the thick carpet. Under normal circumstances, I might have dismissed it as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But after everything else that had happened, my nerves were already frayed. I stood at my bedroom door, ear pressed against the wood, listening intently. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside, the house was silent. I knew I had to check. Not investigating would mean a sleepless night of wondering and worrying. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. The upstairs hallway was empty, shadows pooling in the corners where my bedroom light didn't reach. The only other room up here was my home office, which doubled as a library. I rarely used it at night, preferring to work downstairs where the view of the lake provided a natural backdrop. I was about to step into the hallway when the silence was shattered by the sudden blare of my TV downstairs, turned up to full volume. The sound was so unexpected, so jarring in the quiet house, that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart hammering against my ribs, I ran downstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. The living room was dark, except for the flickering light of the TV. The documentary I'd been watching earlier was playing again, the narrator's voice booming through the speakers. I approached cautiously, scanning the room for any movement. When I reached the TV, I quickly hit the power button on the back, plunging the room into darkness once again. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. The remote control wasn't on the coffee table where I'd left it. In fact, it wasn't anywhere in the living room. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and turned on its flashlight. I had to be sure. I made my way back upstairs, moving as quietly as I could. The beam of my flashlight swept across the hallway, then into my office. There, lying in the middle of the floor near the closet, was the TV remote. My mind raced to make sense of it. Had I brought it up here earlier? No, I was certain I hadn't been in this room all evening. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone else was in my house. Someone had been moving around, watching me, playing some sort of twisted game. Without hesitation, I ran back downstairs and out into the storm, the frigid air burning my lungs as I sprinted toward my nearest neighbor's house, a quarter-mile down the road. I called the police from there, and when they arrived 20 minutes later, they found clear evidence of an intruder. A bathroom window on the ground floor had been expertly jimmied open. The marks so subtle they would have been easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. They also found footprints in the snow outside, leading to and from that window, though the ongoing storm had nearly obscured them. The investigation revealed that the tire tracks I'd seen in my driveway earlier were likely from the intruder checking if anyone was home. When they'd knocked and received no answer, they must have circled back later to break in. The most disturbing part was that nothing was stolen. Not my laptop, not my wallet, not even the expensive camera equipment I keep in my office. The police increased patrols in the area, but they never caught whoever it was. They suggested the incident might have been related to a string of similar break-ins across the state, where the intruder seemed more interested in observing their victims than stealing from them. I've since installed a comprehensive security system, complete with cameras covering every angle of the house and grounds. I added motion sensor lights around the entire perimeter and replaced all the windows with impact-resistant glass. But sometimes, especially during snowstorms, I still find myself checking behind my chair, unable to shake the memory of that puddle of melted snow and the remote control lying on my office floor. The incident taught me that the comfort of solitude can quickly transform into the terror of isolation. Now, when the snow falls and the wind howls around my house, I make sure every door and window is locked. Every security camera is functioning, and my phone is always within reach. Because sometimes, the worst part isn't knowing someone was in your house. It's not knowing what they wanted. This peculiar event occurred about 7 years ago, and it still haunts my thoughts to this day. I was 25 at the time, pursuing my newfound passion for wildlife photography in the Scottish Highlands. The rugged landscape was both beautiful and intimidating, with its ancient pine forests and misty peaks that seemed to touch the clouds. I had some experience with hiking and outdoor photography, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. The Scottish Highlands were known for their unpredictable weather and challenging terrain, which kept most casual tourists on the well-marked paths. The area was also home to various wildlife, including red deer and golden eagles, making it a perfect spot for my photography projects. Instead of staying at the popular tourist locations, I decided to venture onto a lesser-known trail that wound through the dense pine forest along the western slopes. The path was barely visible, covered with fallen pine needles and moss, leading to what locals called the Eagle's View, a clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. The nearest marked trail was about 4 miles away, leading to a popular loch, which was exactly why I avoided it. My instincts proved right. Throughout the entire hike, I hadn't encountered another soul. The trail seemed practically abandoned, and when I reached the clearing, it was gloriously empty. I set up my tent on the far side, using some large rocks to create a fire pit. With about 3 hours of daylight remaining, I spent time scouting potential spots for tomorrow's photo shoot. As darkness fell, I built a fire and settled in for some stargazing, enjoying the simple pleasure of toasting marshmallows. The valley was incredibly peaceful, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional call of a night bird. The fire cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. Then something broke through the silence, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through dead leaves. It was coming from the forest behind me. My heart began to race as I realized it was definitely human footsteps, not an animal. I sat frozen, staring into the darkness, until a figure emerged at the edge of my campsite. It was a man, but the flickering firelight made it difficult to make out his features. He carried a typical hiking backpack, and that was all I could clearly discern. He stood there scanning my campsite, and before I could say anything, he whispered sorry in an oddly quiet voice, then turned and walked back the way he came. The encounter left me feeling unsettled. What was he sorry for? He must have been looking for a campsite, but his behavior was unlike any hiker I'd ever met. His footsteps faded back into the night, and despite my unease, I tried to return to my stargazing, telling myself he was probably just lost and embarrassed. Hours passed, and clouds began rolling in, obscuring the stars and casting the forest into deeper darkness. I wasn't tired yet, so I remained by the fire, hoping the warmth and light would eventually lull me to sleep. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were rushed, almost panicked, coming from the same direction as before. The same man burst into my campsite, but this time he came closer to the fire. Now I could see him clearly. He had a scruffy brown beard and dark hair matted with sweat. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his face was scratched and smeared with mud. But what struck me most were his eyes wide with terror, yet his expression remained oddly blank. "Are you all right?" I asked, concerned. "You should have reached your campsite by now. It's quite late." The man was catching his breath, but something about his posture suggested he was ready to bolt at any moment. His eyes kept darting to a spot just over my right shoulder, then back to me. "Are you lost?" "I can help," I offered. He muttered no under his breath, saying he was just hiking, but his words were slow and deliberate, and his eyes continued their strange dance between me and whatever he thought he saw behind me. "Listen," I said, "you seem distressed." "I have a radio. I can call for help." He cut me off, suddenly fixing his gaze intently on me. "Why are you camping here?" The way he asked made my skin crawl. His eyes darted to my right again, and I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. Nothing but dark woods. "Is it just you here?" He continued, his voice growing more agitated. "Where are the others? Have you been following me?" I shook my head, completely baffled. "No, I don't know what you're talking about." His eyes shifted over my shoulder one final time, but now they stayed there, growing wider with horror. "Then why are you with her?" I spun around instantly, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dark forest. When I turned back, his face had transformed into a mask of pure terror. Without another word, he sprinted into the woods, heading away from any trail or path I knew of. My heart was pounding as I scanned the darkness around me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In those few seconds after his final question, I'd pieced together a terrifying theory that he was being pursued by someone. And when I looked behind me, I'd fully expected to see a woman standing there, wild-eyed and menacing. I packed up my camp in record time, not wanting to stay a moment longer. Though I'd seen him run in the opposite direction from the trail, every snapping twig and rustling leaf had me jumping, expecting to see either the man or this mysterious her he'd spoken of. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local police station. After years of discussing this experience with others, I've developed a theory about what happened that night. The most likely explanation is that the man had become lost in the vast highland wilderness, suffering from dehydration and exposure to the point where he was experiencing paranoid delusions. In his confused state, he might not have recognized that I was offering help, too caught up in his paranoid fantasy about being followed. While this rational explanation makes the most sense, there's always that niggling doubt. What if he really was being pursued by someone, and his erratic behavior was actually an attempt to warn me? If that's the case, then his unsettling performance that night might have saved my life from whatever, or whoever, was out there in the darkness. The truth remains a mystery. The man was never found, despite extensive searches of the area. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about those eyes filled with terror, yet somehow vacant, and that final, chilling question: then why are you with her? I never imagined that my writer's block would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. As a mystery novelist facing a looming deadline, I'd been procrastinating far too long on my latest manuscript. With my publisher breathing down my neck, I had no choice but to pull an all-nighter in my Victorian-era home. A place that usually inspired my writing, but would soon become the setting of my own horror story. The house, a century-old structure with creaking floorboards and towering windows, had always provided the perfect atmosphere for crafting my murder mysteries. That night, I brewed a strong cup of Earl Grey tea and settled into my study upstairs, determined to make significant progress on my overdue manuscript. For several hours, the words flowed surprisingly well. The only sounds were my fingers tapping against the keyboard and the occasional sigh of the old house settling. As my tea grew cold and my energy began to wane, I decided to venture downstairs for a fresh cup. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I felt something was off. A noticeable chill permeated the air, entirely different from the cozy warmth of my study. At first, I dismissed it as the heating acting up again. This old house was full of quirks, after all. But when I checked the thermostat, I noticed the temperature had dropped several degrees below its setting. Following my investigative instincts, perhaps influenced by too many hours writing detective stories, I began searching for the source of the cold. That's when I noticed the bay window in my living room, standing wide open. My heart skipped a beat. While I often opened the windows during the day to let in fresh air, I was religious about closing them before sunset, a habit ingrained from years of living alone. I approached the window cautiously, my writer's imagination conjuring all sorts of scenarios. The ground below showed no signs of disturbance, and the window frame was clean of any marks that might suggest forced entry. Logic tried to convince me that I'd simply forgotten to close it earlier, even though I knew better. After securing the window, I grabbed my fresh tea and hurried back upstairs, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But concentration proved impossible. Every creak and groan of the house now seemed sinister rather than charming. 30 minutes later, I gave in to my paranoia and decided to do a quick sweep of the house. Each room appeared normal, untouched, exactly as it should be. I was almost starting to feel foolish about my concerns. Another hour passed as I forced myself to focus on my writing. Then came the sound, a heavy thump from behind my desk, as if something substantial had fallen against the wall. My bedroom lay on the other side of that wall, and while the sound was too loud to ignore, its source wasn't immediately obvious. Heart pounding, I rose from my desk and walked to my bedroom door. From the doorway, everything looked perfectly normal. The antique four-poster bed was still neatly made, and nothing appeared out of place. But something kept nagging at me, some detail I was missing. Then it hit me, the walk-in closet. It was a narrow space I mainly used for storing old manuscripts and winter clothes, so insignificant that I'd almost forgotten its existence. Without thinking, I walked over and slid open the door. Time seemed to stop. There, among my hanging coats and stacked boxes, stood a man I'd never seen before. He was pressed against the back wall, barely breathing, his eyes locked with mine. Before I could scream, he lunged forward, tearing through my hanging clothes like a wild animal. As I fled into the hallway, he called out my name, Miss Wilson, in a gravelly voice that sent ice through my veins. How did he know who I was? The way he said it suggested familiarity, as if we were old acquaintances, making the situation even more terrifying. I I ran downstairs and out of the house, his footsteps thundering behind me. Oddly, he seemed more intent on calling out to me than actually catching me, which somehow made the whole experience even more disturbing. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house around the corner, pounding on their door until they answered and called the police. When the police searched my house, the intruder was gone, leaving behind no trace of his presence except for my disturbed closet. The most chilling realization came later. This person had been hiding in my closet mere feet away from where I sat working for at least an hour. He had known my name, suggesting this wasn't a random break-in, but rather a targeted invasion of my home. The police investigation revealed that the intruder had likely entered through the living room window while I was making tea earlier that evening. His knowledge of my name and the layout of my house suggested he had been watching me for some time, perhaps even drawing inspiration from my own mystery novels to plan his break-in. I've since installed a state-of-the-art security system and moved my study to a different room, but the incident has left an indelible mark on my psyche. The thought that I might have simply gone to bed that night, unaware of the stranger lurking in my closet, still sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting for another opportunity. One thing's for certain, my next novel will be drawing from a very different kind of personal experience. The events I'm about to share happened just last month, turning what should have been a simple walk home into a nightmare that still haunts me. As a third-year art student at Riverside University, I usually spent my weekends in the studio, but this particular Saturday was different. My roommate Anna was celebrating her 22nd birthday, and there was no way I could miss it. The gathering wasn't meant to be anything extravagant, just our close-knit group of friends from the art department having drinks and catching up. I lived in the student apartments, just a 30-minute walk from Anna's house, and I'd made this journey countless times before. The party was exactly what we needed, intimate and relaxed, with soft music playing in the background as we shared stories and laughed over old memories. As the night wore on, we might have had a few more drinks than initially planned. By 1 a.m, most people had either left or claimed spots on Anna's couches for the night. I've always been particular about sleeping in my own bed, but I was also aware that I shouldn't drive. The walk home seemed like the most sensible option. I knew these streets well, and the route through our college town was usually quiet and safe. Anna offered to let me stay, but I insisted I'd be fine walking. After all, I had done it numerous times before. The night was pleasantly cool, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees that lined the suburban streets. The neighborhoods were peaceful, with most houses dark and silent. The familiar path felt almost meditative, until a pair of headlights interrupted my solitude. The car approached slowly, its lights dim and non-threatening. As it drew closer, it gradually came to a stop beside me. The window rolled down partially, though the interior remained dark enough that I couldn't make out the driver's features. A man's voice, calm and seemingly concerned, asked if I was okay or needed a ride somewhere. I politely declined, thanking him for his offer. Without further conversation, he drove away. His tone had seemed genuinely helpful, and I thought nothing more of it. Random acts of kindness weren't uncommon in our small university town. I continued walking, enjoying the quiet night. A few minutes later, a reflected light caught my attention. Turning around, I saw the same car approaching from the opposite direction. This time, instead of passing by, it pulled over and parked. Something about this felt wrong. What were the chances he'd turn around and stop right where he could see me? I kept walking, frequently glancing back until the car was out of sight. My pace quickened slightly, though I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I was only about 10 minutes from my apartment when I spotted another car ahead, parked awkwardly in the middle of the road with its headlights on. As I got closer, my heart sank. It was the same vehicle. The circumstances couldn't be coincidental anymore. I knew I had two options: continue along the street or take the shortcut through Palmer Park, which had a walking path cutting through a small wooded area. Normally, I avoided the park at night since the path wasn't lit, but now I had to make a choice. The car was parked suspiciously close to the park entrance, almost as if someone had planned it that way. As I approached, something felt increasingly wrong about the whole situation. Following my intuition, I decided to stay on the street rather than take the path through the park. As I passed the car, I realized with horror that it was empty. Looking back toward the park entrance, I could barely make out a figure standing among the trees, watching me. My blood ran cold. Without hesitation, I started running, pulling out my phone as I went. The sound of a car door slamming and an engine starting spurred me to run faster. But instead of following me, the vehicle made a U-turn and sped away. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. Later, when I reported the incident to the campus police, they confirmed my suspicions. This had likely been an attempted abduction. The man had probably anticipated that a young woman walking alone would choose the shortcut through the park, where he would have been waiting. The thought of what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts still makes me shudder. If I had taken that path through the park, I would have walked right into his trap. The darkness and isolation would have left me completely vulnerable. A month has passed, and they still haven't found the man. All I could provide was a vague description of his car and the sound of his voice. Now I never walk alone at night, and I've signed up for self-defense classes. The incident served as a harsh reminder that sometimes the most dangerous situations arise when we least expect them, and that our instincts, when we listen to them, can be our strongest allies. From the moment I first saw someone riding a bicycle in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I knew that's what I wanted most in life. There was something magical about the way cyclists moved through the streets, free as birds, conquering distances with nothing but their own strength and determination. But my parents, ever cautious, never allowed it. They'd heard too many stories about accidents, about careless drivers, about children who never made it home. So I spent my childhood watching others enjoy what I couldn't have. My face pressed against our living room window as neighborhood kids raced past, their laughter carrying on the wind. When I turned 23, with my first real paycheck from my job at the local tech startup, I finally bought my own bicycle. It wasn't anything fancy, just a reliable hybrid bike with solid tires and decent brakes. But to me, It represented everything I'd dreamed of for so long. Within months, cycling became more than just a hobby. It transformed into my escape, my meditation, my way of processing the world. Local cyclists often talked about the trails in Harrisburg State Forest, describing them with a mixture of awe and caution. They spoke of ancient trees that seemed to touch the sky, of trails that wound through the wilderness like serpents, and sometimes, in hushed tones, they mentioned the strange things that happened there. Stories of hikers who ventured off-trail and were never seen again, of mysterious sounds echoing through the valleys at dusk, of shadows that moved against the wind. I dismissed these tales as local folklore, the kind every small town accumulates like dust in its corners. By early October, I'd become confident enough to tackle these remote trails alone. I'd done several solo rides before, each one pushing me further into the forest's embrace, each return building my confidence. That fateful Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that seems to sparkle with possibility. The weather forecast promised perfect riding conditions, cool temperatures, clear skies, and just enough wind to keep the mosquitoes away. I packed my backpack methodically. Basic repair tools, energy bars, 2 full water bottles, a first aid kit, and my fully charged phone, though I knew service would be spotty at best in the deeper parts of the forest. I started my ride around 9 in the morning, the sun still climbing in the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the trail. The first few miles were peaceful, almost meditative. The forest was alive with the sounds of early autumn leaves rustling in the breeze, squirrels chattering as they prepared for winter, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the well-maintained trails gradually gave way to more challenging terrain. The path narrowed, winding between ancient trees, whose branches formed a natural tunnel overhead. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the deep silence of the wilderness. It was past noon when I noticed something wrong with my bike. The handling felt off, and there was a subtle wobble in the front wheel that hadn't been there before. I stopped immediately, knowing that even minor mechanical issues could become dangerous on remote trails. As I dismounted to inspect the problem, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The familiar background noise, birds, insects, wind in the trees, all fell away, leaving behind a silence so complete it made my ears ring. Kneeling on the dirt trail, I discovered a slow leak in my front tire. Annoying but not catastrophic. I had the tools and knowledge to fix it. I removed my backpack and began searching for my repair kit, trying to ignore the growing unease that crept along my spine. That's when I heard it, the sound of leaves crunching somewhere in the undergrowth behind me. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the dense foliage. "Hello," I called out, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Anyone there?" The forest absorbed my words without echo, offering no response except that heavy, waiting silence. The sound had stopped so suddenly that I began to rationalize it, probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, working quickly to remove the tire and locate the puncture. But then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, a scream shattered the silence. It wasn't an animal sound. I'd heard enough foxes and bobcats to know the difference. This was human, or at least, It started that way before twisting into something else, something that made my blood run cold. The scream seemed to go on forever, rising and falling like a broken siren, before cutting off as abruptly as it had begun. I dropped my tools, standing so quickly I nearly lost my balance. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source of that terrible sound. The forest had changed somehow. The shadows seemed deeper, the trees more menacing, their branches reaching toward me like gnarled fingers. Movement caught my eye, a flash of white among the dark trees. Emerging from the thick undergrowth was a figure that made my mind rebel against what my eyes were seeing. It appeared to be a woman, tall and impossibly thin, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the forest's gloom. The dress was old-fashioned, the kind you might see in century-old photographs, but it was the state of it that made my skin crawl torn and stained with what looked like mud and something darker, something that might have been blood. Her face was pale as milk, framed by long dark hair that hung in wet strands. She stood absolutely still, unnatural in her stillness, like a photograph come to life. Then she raised one thin arm, pointing directly at me with a finger that seemed too long, too sharp. My voice barely worked as I stammered, Do you need help?" But she remained motionless, her face a mask of empty serenity that somehow seemed more terrifying than any expression of anger or hatred could have been. Then her mouth began to open, slowly, impossibly wide, stretching beyond what any human jaw should allow. The scream that erupted from that grotesque opening was the same one I'd heard before, but closer now, full of harmonics that set my teeth on edge and made my vision blur. Panic surged through me like electricity. Without conscious thought, I abandoned my bike and repair tools, turning to run down the trail. I could hear her pursuing me, her feet making no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. But somehow I knew she was getting closer. The sound of her screaming filled the forest, seeming to come from all directions at once. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, the trail ahead blurring through tears of terror. Every shadow seemed to reach for me. Every tree seemed to bend toward me as I passed. The scream continued, growing louder, closer, until I could almost feel its vibration in my bones. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw a figure in the distinctive green uniform of a forest ranger. He was standing near a massive oak, and the sight of him sent a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. "Help," I gasped, my voice ragged. "Please, someone's chasing me." The ranger, whose name Tag read Holbrook, reacted instantly. He raised his rifle, aiming it over my shoulder. 2 shots cracked through the forest, the sound impossibly loud after the otherworldly screaming. The shots weren't aimed to hit. They were warning shots, fired high into the canopy. The screaming stopped. When I finally found the courage to look back, the woman in white was gone. The forest had returned to normal. Birds were singing again, leaves rustling in the breeze as if nothing had happened. Ranger Holbrook helped me catch my breath, his weathered face grave as I tried to explain what I'd seen. He listened without interruption, then said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first to see her." He explained that there had been sightings for years, a woman in white, always alone, always screaming. Local legend said she was Elizabeth Caldwell, who disappeared in the forest in 1873 while searching for her lost child. Some said she still searched, her grief and madness transforming her into something no longer human. Together, we walked back to retrieve my bike. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, though the repair tools were scattered, as if thrown by an angry hand. Ranger Hallbrook helped me fix the tire, keeping watch the entire time, his rifle ready. That evening, I reported everything to the local police. Officer Robert Miller took my statement, his expression growing increasingly concerned as I spoke. He shared that there had been other incidents, hikers gone missing, strange sounds reported, unexplained phenomena that the department kept quiet to avoid causing panic. They investigated, of course. Teams searched the area where I'd seen the woman, but found nothing except some strange markings on the trees, deep scratches that no animal could have made, arranged in patterns that made no sense. I still ride my bike, but never alone now, and never in Harrisburg State Forest. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear screaming in the distance, carried on the breeze like a warning or a lament. The local newspaper occasionally reports missing persons in that area, and each time I wonder if they saw her too, if they heard that terrible scream that seemed to come from somewhere between this world and whatever lies beyond it. The incident changed how I view the world. The neat, rational explanations we tell ourselves about reality seem thinner now, more fragile. Sometimes, when I pass the forest's edge on my way to work, I catch glimpses of something white moving among the trees. I don't stop to look anymore. Some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unexplored. Darkness comes early in Rochester, Minnesota, especially during the autumn months, when the soybeans turn that particular shade of gold that whispers of harvest time. I live far enough outside town that streetlights feel like a distant memory, and my nearest neighbor's house is just a warm glow on the horizon. Out here, silence has weight. You can feel it pressing against your skin, filling your ears with the sound of your own heartbeat. Every evening after our shifts at the local medical research facility, my best friend Thomas and I would meet at the edge of town for our usual 20-mile ride. Our route was a familiar one, cutting past the abandoned St. Mary's Hospital, skirting two man-made lakes that developers had abandoned half-finished during the housing crisis, then diving into a corridor of second-growth forest that seemed to stretch forever before finally spitting us back out onto the farmland. We'd ridden this route so many times we could have drawn every crack in the asphalt from memory, could have predicted every pothole and rough patch without looking. It was our escape, our way of processing the long hours spent in sterile labs and fluorescent-lit corridors. That Tuesday in late October, we left later than usual. The research project had run long, and by the time I'd changed clothes and pedaled to our meeting spot, the sun was already flirting with the horizon. I almost suggested we skip the ride, but Thomas just laughed, his breath visible in the cooling air. 20 miles is nothing, he said, adjusting his helmet. We'll beat the dark. The first 8 miles felt normal, familiar. Cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides, their dry stalks rustling in the wind like whispered conversations. Red-winged blackbirds swooped across our path, their wings catching the last rays of sunlight. But as we approached the old hospital grounds, something felt different. The usual evening chorus of crickets and frogs fell silent, replaced by a stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We coasted into the tree line just as the sun disappeared completely, leaving us in that strange twilight where shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Long bars of fading orange light slanted through the trees, making the path ahead look like a tunnel into another world. The road dipped and climbed like a ribbon thrown carelessly across the hills. Two small rises, then a sweeping left turn that brought us to the steepest climb on our route. Thomas shifted down and stood on his pedals, attacking the hill with his usual energy. Halfway up, he suddenly coasted to a stop, raising one hand in warning. I pulled up beside him, my question dying in my throat as I saw what had caught his attention. At the crest of the hill, maybe 60 feet ahead, a figure stood motionless on the gravel shoulder. The failing light caught them from behind, turning them into a dark silhouette that seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too still, their proportions slightly off in ways I couldn't quite define. They faced the woods, not the road, as if they'd stepped out of a vehicle that wasn't there and forgotten why they'd come. We rolled closer, our tires crunching softly on the gravel. At 20 feet out, Thomas called out, "Hey, everything okay?" The figure gave no indication they'd heard. Thomas unclipped from his pedals, his shoes making too much noise in the unnatural quiet, and tried again, louder this time. "Sir." "Ma'am, do you need help?" The figure's shoulders remained perfectly still, but their head turned, just the head, rotating far too smoothly, far too far. What had been a silhouette became a face that made my stomach lurch. It appeared young at first glance, but the skin had a gray, waxy quality that reminded me of the cadavers in our research facility. The eyes were wrong, too large, too bright, seeming to reflect light that wasn't there. The mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that gleamed like broken glass. Those impossible eyes didn't focus on us. They seemed to look through us, as if we were the ghosts and not whatever this thing was. Then the mouth began to open wider, stretching into a rictus grin that kept growing until the jaw trembled with the strain. No sound emerged, but the air grew heavy and thick, like trying to breathe underwater. Thomas stepped back, his bike clattering against mine. "No," he said, his voice cracking with terror. "We're gone." Now we turned and fled down the far side of the hill, our bikes rattling dangerously over the frost heaves and potholes we usually navigated so carefully. I kept checking my handlebar mirror, but could see only trees whipping past in the gathering darkness. We didn't slow until we reached the lakes, where the first stars were beginning to reflect on the black water. Neither of us spoke on the ride home. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle, every creak and groan making me jump. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of that face, those eyes that seemed to see something beyond this world. The next afternoon, I convinced myself I needed proof that it had really happened, that we hadn't somehow shared a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and low blood sugar. Thomas had a medical conference, so I drove alone to the spot, parking at the first lake. Storm clouds gathered in the west, making the afternoon feel more like dusk. I walked my bike up the hill where we'd seen the figure. The shoulder was empty, but fresh tire marks scarred the asphalt where we'd made our panicked escape. Looking closer, I found something else, a set of impressions in the gravel, too long and deep to be human footprints, arranged in a pattern that made my head hurt to look at. following some instinct I couldn't name. I pushed through the underbrush where the figure had been facing. 10 feet in, the trees opened into what must have been a small parking lot decades ago. Broken concrete pushed up through the soil like ancient bones. In the center stood a metal pole that might once have held a sign or street light. Hanging from it was a length of chain, its links massive and black with rust. It swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Scattered around the base of the pole were small objects that I first took for stones. Looking closer, I realized they were human teeth, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles. In the center lay a small brass nameplate, the kind hospitals used to identify staff. Though tarnished almost beyond recognition, I could just make out part of a name. Dr. M. Research Division. A twig snapped in the deeper woods, and I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, doors locked, engine running. That evening I called Thomas, my hands shaking as I related every detail. He listened in silence, then whispered, "I haven't been sleeping either." He told me that every night around 3 a.m., he heard footsteps outside his second-floor bedroom window. 2 days later, he visited the site himself, hoping daylight would reveal a logical explanation. Instead, he found a white van parked near where we'd seen the figure, its windows covered with old newspapers. No license plates, no identifying marks. He called the sheriff's department from the safety of his car. When deputies arrived an hour later, the van was gone, leaving only rectangular depressions in the grass and a lingering smell of decay. The following week passed in fragments of sleepless nights and anxious days. Work at the research facility felt different now. The long corridors seemed darker, the shadows in the corners deeper. We changed our riding route, sticking to open roads where we could see for miles in every direction. Then the posts started appearing on local social media. Blurry photos taken at twilight, showing a figure standing by the road near the old hospital grounds. Sometimes it appeared as we'd seen it, humanoid but wrong. Other times it seemed more mechanical, joints bent at impossible angles, head rotating completely backward. The photos were quickly deleted. The accounts that posted them disappeared, but the stories spread. Thomas and I don't ride that route anymore. We sold our bikes and took up running instead, always in populated areas, always in daylight. But sometimes, driving home late from work, I catch glimpses of something standing by the road, something tall and still, face turned toward the old hospital grounds, as if waiting for something to emerge from the abandoned buildings. The research facility where we work has a new wing now. The windows, always dark, no matter the time of day. Sometimes we hear sounds from behind its locked doors, mechanical whirring, electronic beeps, and occasionally, something that might be laughter or might be screaming. None of us ask questions anymore. Some answers are better left undiscovered. The mountains of Burlington, Vermont, have always called to me. Since childhood, I'd watched them from my bedroom window, their peaks disappearing into clouds, their forests hiding countless secrets. When I finally saved enough money from my job as a historical researcher to buy a proper mountain bike, those green slopes became my sanctuary, my escape from the endless parade of dusty documents and faded photographs that filled my working hours. everything changed that September morning when I discovered the hidden trail. I'd been exploring the less traveled paths of the Green Mountain National Forest, pushing myself further into the wilderness with each ride. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, leaves just beginning to hint at their coming transformation. I'd stopped to check my map when I noticed it, a narrow track branching off the main trail, barely visible through the undergrowth. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was the way the morning mist seemed to curl around it like fingers, or how the surrounding trees bent inward, creating a natural archway. The trail quickly narrowed, becoming more overgrown with each passing minute. Soon it was clear that no one had used this path in years, possibly decades. The trees grew denser, their ancient branches blocking most of the daylight, leaving me riding through a green twilight that seemed to pulse with its own life. After about 40 minutes of careful navigation, the path opened suddenly into a vast clearing. What I found there made me question everything I thought I knew about local history. A massive stone wall rose before me, easily 15 feet high, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Behind it stood what appeared to be the ruins of a structure unlike anything I'd ever seen in New England, angular and geometric, but with proportions that seemed to defy natural law. I took out my phone to document the discovery, but the screen showed only static. Even my usually reliable GPS watch displayed impossible coordinates, the numbers changing randomly, as if confused by some unknown interference. That's when I heard it, a sound like footsteps, but wrong somehow, as if whatever was walking had too many legs, or perhaps none at all. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, but the only response was a deep silence that seemed to swallow my words. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by a soft clicking sound that reminded me of the old telegraph machines I'd studied in the Historical Society's archives. My rational mind tried to dismiss it as wildlife, but the primitive part of my brain that remembers our species' ancient fears screamed that this was something else entirely. I turned to leave, only to find my path blocked by a figure that defied description. It wore what appeared to be an old park ranger's uniform, but the fabric rippled and moved as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Where its face should have been, there was only a dark void that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. The entity raised an arm too long, too fluid, pointing not at me, but at the stone wall behind me. A voice filled my head, not heard with my ears, but felt in my bones. The boundary must be maintained. The seal must not be broken. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I abandoned my bike and ran, crashing through undergrowth, branches whipping my face. The thing pursued me, moving in complete silence now, but I could feel its presence getting closer, the air growing colder with each step it took. I might have died there if not for Peter Dawson, the local historian I'd interviewed just weeks before about the region's indigenous history. He was hiking the main trail, carrying his ever-present walking stick, when I burst out of the undergrowth. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know. He pushed me behind him and raised his walking stick, which I now saw was covered in symbols similar to those on the stone wall. The air between us and the trail I'd fled from seemed to ripple, like heat waves off summer asphalt. The presence I'd felt pursuing me recoiled, retreating back into the darkness between the trees. When I could finally speak again, Peter led me to a small cabin he used as a research station. Over cups of strong coffee, he explained what I'd stumbled upon. The wall I'd found wasn't just a structure. It was a boundary marker, one of several placed by the area's original inhabitants to contain something they'd discovered in the mountains. Something that had been old when the first humans arrived in North America. The symbols were a form of warning and protection, maintained for generations by selected guardians. The entity I'd encountered was one such guardian, transformed by its duty into something no longer entirely human. But the old ways were being forgotten, the boundaries weakening, and things that should remain contained were beginning to stir. Peter showed me photographs from the Historical Society's archives, images dating back to the 1800s, showing similar figures in ranger uniforms. Their faces always blurred or obscured. Reports of missing hikers and cyclists, spanning more than a century, each disappearance occurring near one of the boundary markers. That evening, at Peter's insistence, I reported the incident to the local authorities. Sheriff Mark Anderson listened to my story with an expression that suggested he'd heard similar tales before. He showed me a map marked with red dots, missing persons, reports clustered around certain areas of the forest. Areas that, when connected, formed patterns matching the symbols I'd seen on the wall. I still ride my bike, but never alone now, and never off the marked trails. Peter gave me a pendant carved with protective symbols, which I wear whenever I'm in the mountains. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear something like clicking Morse code coming from the deeper parts of the forest. I don't try to decode it anymore. The Historical Society's archives are different now too. Photographs seem to change when no one's looking directly at them. Documents rearrange themselves overnight. Last week, I found a journal from 1875 that hadn't been there the day before. Its pages filled with descriptions of things that couldn't exist, written in a hand that looked disturbingly like my own. The mountains still call to me, but now I understand it's not just their beauty that draws people in. They're trying to tell us something, trying to warn us about what they contain. The boundaries are weakening. The guardians are fewer with each passing generation. And sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is hidden, I see lights moving on the mountain slopes where no lights should be. Peter says we're approaching a turning point, a time when the old boundaries will fail completely if they're not renewed. He's teaching me the symbols, the rituals, the responsibilities of a guardian. I'm not sure I'm ready for such a duty, but I understand now that some choices are made for us by forces we can barely comprehend. The bike trails are different now too. Maps show routes that didn't exist the day before, while familiar paths vanish without trace. The forest is changing, preparing for something. And in the distance, always watching, stand the silent guardians in their ranger uniforms, their void faces turned toward something approaching from beyond the weakening boundaries of our world. I still remember that night in the Carpathian Mountains. It was my first time at the International Scout Camp, and being 11 years old, I was determined to prove I wasn't just some scared kid anymore. The whole experience was different from anything I'd known back home in Poland. The thick, ancient forests, the misty peaks, and the wild, untamed feel of the Ukrainian wilderness. Our group had hiked about 7 miles from the main camp, led by Mr. Patterson, an experienced mountaineer with a salt and pepper beard and weather-worn face. Most kids chose to set up their tents near the central camping area, but my friends Oliver, Thomas, and I convinced Mr. Patterson to let us camp a bit further out, near an old spruce grove. Just 40 yards, we promised, though looking back, it was probably closer to 60. The evening started normally enough. We gathered firewood, set up our tent, and listened to Mr. Patterson's stories about the local mountains. He mentioned old tales about wolves in these parts, not the usual stories, but ones about wolves that moved like shadows and hunted in perfect silence. We laughed it off, more concerned about the beans and sausages we'd had for dinner and their inevitable effect on our tense atmosphere. As night fell, the forest transformed. The massive spruces turned into towering black giants against the star-filled sky. I lay in my sleeping bag, watching satellites drift between the gaps in the canopy. The branches above looked like an intricate spider web against the cosmic backdrop. Oliver and Thomas fell asleep quickly, their soft snores mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves. That's when I heard it, soft footsteps in the darkness. At first, I thought it was someone from the main camp, but there was something off about the sound. Pad, pad, pad. Deliberate, measured, moving around our tent in a perfect circle. I sat up, my heart thumping. The footsteps continued, now just 15 feet away. Through the tent's thin walls, I could only see darkness beyond. The steps moved in a precise pattern left side, behind me, right side, then past our feet. The direction where the main camp lay was now completely silent. My bladder was bursting, but fear kept me frozen. Finally, desperation won out. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped out, and quickly marked my territory in 3 spots near the tent, trying to convince myself I was establishing some kind of boundary. Back in the tent, clutching my small scout knife and flashlight, the footsteps resumed their patrol. Pad, pad, pad. Then something changed. A twig snapped sharply, followed by a sound that turned my blood to ice. A long, deep growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Hey, keep it down up there, Mr. Patterson's voice carried from the main camp, but there was tension in his words. He knew this wasn't just kids messing around. When morning finally came, we found massive wolf tracks in the soil around our tent, but something was wrong about them. They were too big, too deep, and they formed a perfect circle around our tent. But what really chilled us was finding not one, but 2 distinct sets of tracks, along with patches of fur and dark stains in the grass. Later, Mr. Patterson confirmed what we'd suspected: 2 wolves had been stalking our tent that night. But they'd ended up fighting each other instead of attacking us. The local rangers later told us this was unusual. Wolves rarely fight over prey, especially when there's plenty of food in the forest. Years later, I learned that in the months before our camping trip, 3 people had been killed by wolves in that region of the Carpathians. The locals spoke of something different about these wolves, something that made them hunt alone, in silence, stalking their prey for days. They said these weren't normal wolves, but something else, something that had emerged from the ancient depths of those mountains. I still go camping now and then, but never in the Carpathians. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear those footsteps pat, 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 circling in the darkness. And I wonder what really happened that night in the mountains. I've been hunting deer in northern Maine for most of my life, wandering through those thick pine forests that blanket the countryside. Born and raised in these parts, I know every trail and creek within 20 miles of my hometown. At least I thought I did, until that strange morning last October. The day started like any other hunting trip. I drove out well before sunrise, parking my old pickup off a dirt road near Blackwater Creek. The morning mist was unusually thick, clinging to everything like a ghost's breath. I picked my way through the undergrowth to a small clearing I discovered earlier in the season perfect spot for deer to graze. Setting up was routine position, the decoy, settle against an ancient oak, start my quiet calls. If you know anything about deer hunting, you know it's all about patience. You get comfortable, stay still, and wait. The early morning light was just starting to filter through the canopy when I heard a distant rustling. My heart quickened, maybe a buck responding to my calls. But then I heard something else, something that made my skin crawl. Crying, not animal sounds, not the wind, but human crying, soft and desperate, like a child lost in the woods. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Could be a fox. They make some pretty unsettling sounds when they're calling. Maybe even a mountain lion, though we hadn't had any confirmed sightings in years. But then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere behind me, in the dense forest. Every instinct told me to stay put, but I couldn't ignore it. What if someone's kid had wandered off from one of the nearby farms? I have nieces and nephews of my own. The thought of any child alone in these woods was unbearable. I grabbed my rifle and started tracking the sound, pushing through thorny brambles and dense cedar thickets. The crying led me to an ancient maple tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, split down the middle by lightning decades ago. Near its base was a dark hollow, large enough for someone to crawl inside. The crying seemed to be coming from within that hollow. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, frozen, trying to peer into the darkness. Before I could gather the courage to look inside, the crying stopped. Just like that, complete silence. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on that hollow until I was a safe distance away. Later that day, I mentioned the incident to my grandfather, a full-blooded Penobscot Indian. His reaction surprised me. He grew very quiet, then told me something that chilled me to my core. In the old days, he explained, when a child died during the harsh Maine winters, the Penobscot people would sometimes place them in hollow trees. They believed the trees would protect their spirits until spring came, when they could pass on peacefully. The spot where I'd been hunting, he said, was near an old Penobscot winter camp. I've thought about that morning many times since then. Sometimes when I'm in those woods, I think about that hollow tree and the tiny voice it held. It reminds me that even places we think we know can harbor deep mysteries. Not every unexplained sound in the forest means danger. Sometimes it's just an echo of profound sadness, a reminder of those who came before us. I still hunt those woods, but now I understand that some things are meant to be remembered, respected, and left undisturbed. Some memories are etched not just in our minds, but in the very land itself, speaking to us through the whispers of ancient trees. I'm just an ordinary 38-year-old man with no history of mental illness, except for occasional anxiety. I've lived a normal life, worked a regular job, and never experienced anything particularly supernatural. That changed when I was 5 years old, back in 1990. It started with what I called the bandaged man. He would appear on the staircase of my grandfather's house, always around bedtime, never in the dead of night. I remember him clearly, dressed in what looked like old hospital clothes, with bandages wrapped around his head, dark stains seeping through the white fabric. The strange thing was, I wasn't scared. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was because someone had told me not to be afraid, or if I was simply too young to understand fear. What I saw, I would later learn, was my great uncle Thomas. He had been attacked with a metal pipe outside a local pub, managed to stumble home, but the injury caused internal bleeding. By the time family members found him the next morning and rushed him to the hospital, it was too late. He passed away after several days in intensive care. This happened in 1984. I wasn't born until December 1985. I saw the bandaged man maybe 20 or 25 times before my mom, and I moved out. He returned 5 years later when I was about 12. While I never saw the bandaged man again, the paranormal activity was far from over. One afternoon, I was teaching my little sister Emma how to play video games. As I was explaining the controls, a woman's voice called her name. The voice was crystal clear, as if someone was standing right beside us. Emma immediately got up and walked to the door, saying, "Coming, Grandma Rose." I froze in terror for 2 reasons. First, the voice wasn't my mother's. It belonged to our grandmother who had passed away 12 years earlier. Second, the voice hadn't come from downstairs where Emma thought. It had come from right at our feet. I sat there paralyzed with fear, while Emma called down to our mom, who was washing dishes and hadn't called anyone. Walking back to bed, Emma suddenly stopped and said, "What's wrong with you? The bandaged man is scary enough without you acting weird too." I was shocked. I asked her who had told her about the bandaged man. Had one of my friends mentioned him? She burst into tears, begging me to believe that she really saw him, insisting none of my friends had told her. She was about 5 then, the same age I had been when I first saw him. The next part involves all my friends. After hearing our grandmother's voice, my bedroom door started behaving strangely. It would shake violently, and we'd hear horrible scratching sounds along the wood. Every sleepover for about a year, my friends and I would huddle in the corner of my bed while this happened. So that's 5 witnesses. My sister and me seeing the bandaged man and hearing the voice, and 3 friends who experienced the door incidents. But the story gets even stranger. We sold the house and moved to another town about a year later. I later learned that we moved because my grandfather, who'd suffered multiple strokes and was in a wheelchair, had started saying disturbing things. He would tell my mom, "Your brother's still here, up and down those stairs all night long." He saw the bandaged man too, his own son. 7 or 8 years after selling the house, the new owner ran into my uncle at a local store. He confronted him, demanding to know what was in that house. He, his wife, and 2 of their children had been seeing my uncle's ghost. I managed to talk to their youngest son once, who said his parents and brothers would see my uncle's reflection in the mirrors. They eventually removed all the mirrors from the house, and the sighting stopped. That's 3 members of my family, 3 friends, and 4 people from another family who essentially experienced the same thing. Sometimes I wonder what really happened in that house all those years ago. What kind of energy or memory was strong enough to touch so many lives in such a profound way? Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.